4 minutes and 18 seconds. That is the recorded interval between the first torpedo impact and the magazine explosion that breaks HMS Barham apart on November 25, 1941. In those 4 minutes and 18 seconds, 862 men die. Not over the course of a battle, not across a day of sustained combat, not during a prolonged sinking where survival decisions accumulate across hours, but inside the span of time it takes to boil a kettle and pour a cup of tea. The ship carries a complement of roughly 1,184 men. The ones who survive, 396 of them, are largely those who happen to be on the upper decks when the torpedoes hit and are thrown clear by the final explosion, rather than pulled down with a battleship displacing 31,900 tons as it rolls and breaks apart in the eastern Mediterranean. The U-boat that does this is U-331, commanded by Oberleutnant Xerxes Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, operating in waters northeast of Sollum off the Egyptian and Libyan coast during a period when the Mediterranean naval war is grinding both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina into continuous attrition across convoy routes, fleet actions, and submarine operations that neither side can afford indefinitely. Barham is not a marginal asset when she sinks. She is a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, the same class as HMS Warspite and HMS Queen Elizabeth herself. Vessels that entered service during the First World War and were modernized during the interwar years with updated fire control, improved anti-aircraft armament, and structural reinforcements. Her main battery carries 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, each gun firing shells weighing 1,920 pounds across distances exceeding 20 miles. Her belt armor runs to 13 inches at its thickest waterline section. She displaces 31,900 tons at full load and requires a crew of over 1,000 men simply to operate her basic systems, let alone fight her in a fleet engagement. Losing a ship of that capability in the Mediterranean in November 1941 is not an abstraction for the Royal Navy's strategic position. It is a concrete subtraction from a force already stretched across the Atlantic Convoy War, the Norwegian campaign's aftermath, the hunt for German surface raiders, and simultaneous operations supporting ground forces in North Africa, where the port of Tobruk and the supply routes feeding 8th Army depend on naval presence that Barham represents a portion of. The specific tactical situation on November 25th places Barham within a battleship formation, Force B, operating as part of a broader fleet movement under Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet. The formation includes HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Valiant, and Barham herself, screened by destroyers conducting anti-submarine sweeps along the fleet's flanks. Anti-submarine screening in 1941 relies on ASDIC sonar, an active pinging system that sends sound pulses through the water and listens for returns from submerged hulls. The technology works, but it works within constraints. A submarine that approaches carefully, uses thermal layers in the water to mask its acoustic signature, and times its attack geometry correctly, can close to firing range against a screened fleet. Von Tiesenhausen does exactly that. U-331 penetrates the destroyer screen and closes to approximately 750 meters from Barham before firing a full salvo of 4 torpedoes from her bow tubes. At that range, the runtime between launch and impact is measured in seconds rather than minutes. The destroyers conducting the screen have no meaningful window to detect, classify, and respond to a contact that is already inside their protective perimeter when it fires. 3 of the 4 torpedoes strike Barham on her port side in rapid succession. Each German G7A torpedo carries a warhead containing approximately 300 kilograms, roughly 660 pounds, of Schießwolle 73 explosive compound. 3 of those warheads detonating against a battleship's hull within seconds of each other produce flooding across multiple compartments simultaneously, a damage distribution that overwhelms the damage control response before it can be organized and directed. A single torpedo hit on a capital ship is survivable with competent damage control. 3 hits in rapid succession fractures the damage control calculus. There are simply too many ruptures opening simultaneously for the available pumps, repair parties, and watertight boundary systems to contain. Barham begins listing to port immediately. The list accelerates over the following minutes as flooding distributes unevenly through compartments that are either already breached or losing their watertight integrity through secondary structural damage. Men on deck grab whatever fixed structure they can reach as the angle steepens. Those below decks face flooding passageways and hatches that are either jammed by the structural distortion or already submerged on the listing side. At approximately 4 minutes after the torpedo impacts, with Barham rolled past 45 degrees, her after magazines detonate. The explosion is captured on film by a camera crew operating aboard a nearby vessel, footage that becomes one of the most viewed and most viscerally immediate pieces of naval combat film from the entire war. The detonation sends a column of smoke and debris several hundred feet into the air. The ship breaks apart. What remains on the surface sinks within minutes. The Mediterranean closes over a battleship that has been in continuous Royal Navy service since 1915. The Admiralty suppresses the news of Barham's sinking for several weeks. The decision is partly operational security, denying the Germans confirmation that their submarine attack has succeeded, and preventing enemy forces from exploiting the gap in British naval strength before it can be addressed. And partly the broader information management logic that governs how wartime governments release news of catastrophic losses. Barham's families receive notification through the standard casualty telegram process, but public announcement is withheld until January 1942. This creates a situation that produces one of the stranger documented episodes connected to the ship's loss. A British medium named Helen Duncan allegedly conducts a séance in Portsmouth in late November 1941, during which she produces what witnesses describe as a materialization identifying itself as a sailor from HMS Barham, stating the ship has sunk. The Admiralty, concerned that Duncan represents a potential intelligence security breach given the suppression order still in effect, eventually prosecutes her under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 in 1944, making her one of the last people prosecuted under that legislation in British legal history. Whether Duncan's apparent knowledge of Barham's sinking came from supernatural means, from genuine leaks within the Navy's casualty notification system, or from other intelligence pathways, has never been definitively established. The case remains one of the more peculiar legal footnotes attached to any naval disaster of the Second World War. The loss of Barham sits within a period of severe attrition for the Royal Navy's Mediterranean strength. Within weeks of her sinking, Italian frogmen from the 10th Flotilla MAS attach explosive charges to HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant in Alexandria Harbor on December 19, 1941, an operation that temporarily removes both battleships from service, leaving the Mediterranean fleet without operational capital ships at a moment when the naval balance in that theater is already critically stressed. Studying the Mediterranean naval war across the autumn and winter of 1941 through the primary documents, fleet orders, damage reports, casualty returns, and Cunningham's own dispatches, the thing that strikes me most consistently is how thin the margin of operational capacity actually runs. Ships like Barham are not simply units in an order of battle. They are irreplaceable concentrations of trained manpower, mechanical systems, and institutional knowledge that take years to assemble and 4 minutes and 18 seconds to remove. That last number is not rhetorical. It comes directly from the damage assessment and survivor testimony compiled after the sinking, and it is the number that makes the Barham's loss qualitatively different from almost any other capital ship loss in the Royal Navy's Mediterranean War. The speed compresses everything: the tactical failure, the structural vulnerability, the human cost, into an interval so short that it resists the narrative frameworks that longer battles allow. If you are somewhere settled now, the room quiet and the weight of the day already beginning to lift towards sleep, let the Eastern Mediterranean sit in your mind for a moment. November 1941, afternoon light on warm blue water. 3 British battleships moving in formation with their destroyer screen. From 750 meters underwater, 4 torpedoes are already running. In 4 minutes and 18 seconds, a ship carrying 1,184 men and 8 15-inch guns that have been in Royal Navy service since 1915 will be gone. The Mediterranean does not mark the place. This is the entire history of the sinking of HMS Barham. 862 men lost in 4 minutes during the Second World War. HMS Barham's construction began not with a ship, but with a procurement number. Yard number 424, authorized under the 1912 Naval program and contracted to John Brown and Company at their Clydebank facility, was ordered into being by a committee that had already decided what the Royal Navy's next generation of capital ships should accomplish before any steel had been cut. The design specification called for a vessel displacing approximately 32,500 long tons at normal load, capable of a maximum speed of 25 knots, armed with 8 15-inch breech-loading Mark I guns in 4 twin turrets, and protected by a waterline belt of 13 inches of Krupp cemented armor. Those figures, set down in the Admiralty's design authorization in the middle of 1912, were not aspirations. They were the hard parameters of a program that had committed to a specific fuel type, oil rather than coal, before the Royal Navy had fully secured its oil supply chain. The decision to build oil-fired ships was a strategic calculation that locked an entire class of capital vessels into a logistical dependency that would constrain their operations for the next 3 decades. When the Admiralty chose oil, it chose everything that came with oil: the bunkering infrastructure, the convoy routes to the oil fields, the storage tanks at forward bases, and the vulnerability that comes from any system with a single critical input. The keel was laid down on February 24, 1913. From that point, the vessel, that would eventually be named HMS Barham, was a physical accumulation of procurement decisions, each one generating a downstream constraint that the men who would later sail her could not alter. The hull form was fixed at the design stage. The armament was fixed. The armor distribution was fixed. The position of the magazines, the shell rooms and cordite handling spaces below each of the 4 turrets, arranged in sequence along the ship's centerline, was fixed by the geometry of the turret barbettes, which were themselves fixed by the caliber and weight of the guns. A 15-inch shell weighing approximately 1,920 pounds requires a handling system of a specific mechanical complexity, with hoists running from the shell room through the handing room to the gun loading position. The cordite propellant charges that drove those shells were stored in brass cases in the magazine compartments immediately adjacent to the shell rooms. The physical arrangement of magazine, shell room, hoist, and turret was not a design flaw. It was the only practical way to move that quantity of ordnance to the guns quickly enough to be tactically useful. But it created a concentrated point of vulnerability running the length of the ship's fighting spine, and the protective systems around that spine, the armor, the anti-flash arrangements, the compartment seals, would be tested repeatedly over the following 28 years. She was launched on December 31, 1914, and commissioned on October 19, 1915, at a total construction cost of £2,470,113. That figure doesn't include the ammunition stockpile she needed to operate. A full outfit of 15-inch shells for a Queen Elizabeth-class ship required months of industrial production, each shell machined to tolerances that the Royal Navy's ordnance factories ran on continuous shifts to meet. The logistical tale of a capital ship in 1915 was already enormous before she turned a propeller shaft. Her 4 Brown Curtis steam turbines, rated at 75,000 shaft horsepower when tested under ideal conditions, drove 4 shafts and were fed by 24 Yarrow boilers, burning fuel oil at a rate that varied with speed in a relationship that any engineer understood intuitively. Slow, economical steaming consumed roughly 12 tons per hour, while sustained high-speed operations could push consumption to levels that limited the ship's effective operational radius to a few hundred miles. The ship's range was rated at 5,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. At combat speeds, the envelope contracted sharply. Every operation she ever conducted began with a fuel calculation, and every fuel calculation began with an assumption about what was available at the next port. Her actual sea trials on July 6, 1916, produced a mean top speed of 23.91 knots from the measured mile. The design specification had said 25. That difference of more than 1 knot is not a rounding error. It's a performance gap that compounds over time. A ship operating 3 to 5% below her rated speed in a fleet formation is either working harder to keep station, burning more fuel, or accepting a tactical disadvantage every time the formation needs to maneuver quickly. The Admiralty continued to list the Queen Elizabeth class as capable of 25 knots. The steel under the waterline told a different story. When I work through capital ship performance records from this period and find a systematic pattern of measured speeds falling short of specification, I'm not looking at manufacturing failure. I'm looking at how procurement specifications are written to secure funding approval rather than to document achievable performance, and how that gap between the two figures follows a ship through her entire operational life as a quiet, persistent form of systems friction that nobody is formally responsible for acknowledging. The name she received, Barham, connected her to Admiral Charles Middleton, 1st Baron Barham, the administrative genius of the Royal Navy's late 18th and early 19th century, who reorganized the Navy Board in 1905, and whose logistical competence is generally credited with enabling the concentration of force that made Trafalgar possible. There is something structurally ironic about placing that name on a ship whose subsequent history would be shaped, above all else, by a series of administrative and logistical decisions made above the level of any individual commander. Middleton's career was built on the premise that ships are only as capable as the systems that support them. The ship named in his honor would prove, in ways nobody in 1914 intended, to be an extended demonstration of exactly that premise. She was built to fight. She was built within an industrial, logistical, and institutional system that would determine when she fought, with what protection, against what threat parameters, and, ultimately, with what margin for survival. By the time she was completed and assigned to the 5th Battle Squadron under Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas at Scapa Flow, she was already part of a fleet whose fuel oil logistics were managed on a razor-thin margin. The Grand Fleet at Scapa in 1915 and 16 depended on a continuous pipeline of oil tankers from ports in southern England, because Scapa Flow itself had no fixed fueling infrastructure of the scale the fleet required. Operations had to be planned around refueling cycles. Fleet sorties had to account for the time to replenish before the next engagement. The Battle of Jutland in May and June of 1916, where Barham fired 337 15-inch shells and was hit 6 times without suffering a magazine detonation, was not the end of anything. It was the last piece of baseline data the Royal Navy would have on how a Queen Elizabeth-class ship behaved under fire before she entered a period of progressive modification that would change her structural characteristics in ways that the original design parameters could not fully predict. The post-Jutland modifications installed aboard HMS Barham between her return to service in July 1916 and the end of the First World War were driven by a specific engineering lesson, incompletely learned. 3 British battlecruisers, Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible, had exploded at Jutland when enemy shells penetrated their turrets or barbettes and ignited cordite charges in the handling spaces and magazines below. The Royal Navy's post-battle analysis identified flash fire traveling down the ammunition hoists as the primary ignition mechanism, and the response was to improve anti-flash protection, better hatch seals, enhanced scuttles at the handing room level, modified cordite carrying arrangements, and to add 1 inch of high-tensile steel to the main deck over the magazines. These were meaningful improvements to a specific failure mode. They addressed what had happened at Jutland. They didn't address what might happen differently under different threat parameters in a different conflict. The distinction between those two things is the structural gap at the center of this story. The Queen Elizabeth-class's protection scheme, as designed in 1912, allocated its heaviest armor to the waterline belt, 13 inches of Krupp-cemented steel over the machinery spaces and magazines, and much thinner protection to the horizontal surfaces. The deck armor ranged from 1 to 3 inches. The turret roofs were 4 to 5 inches. The assumption was that the most dangerous threats would arrive on flat or slightly declining trajectories from enemy guns firing at ranges where the shell's ballistic arc was relatively low. At those ranges, belt armor was the critical defensive layer. At longer ranges, where a shell's trajectory becomes steeper, deck armor becomes more important. The post-Jutland modifications added steel above the magazines, acknowledging that longer-range gunnery was a reality. But the fundamental protection philosophy, thick belt, thinner deck, was not revised. The ship that emerged from the immediate post-Jutland repair period was better protected against the threat that had killed HMS Queen Mary. She wasn't yet protected against a torpedo arriving from directly beneath the anti-torpedo bulge with a warhead that hadn't existed when the bulge was designed. Between January 1931 and January 1934, HMS Barham underwent the most significant modification program of her career at a recorded cost of £424,000. The refit added torpedo bulges that increased her beam from 90 feet 7 inches to 104 feet, widening the ship by almost 14 feet to absorb torpedo detonations before they reached the main armored belt. The bulges were fitted along the length of the hull, adding approximately 2,000 tons to the ship's displacement and increasing her deep load figure to 35,970 long tons. The weight increase reduced her sea trial speed further to 22.5 knots from 65,655 shaft horsepower in November 1933. She was measurably slower after the refit than she'd been before it. That was the accepted trade-off: survivability at the cost of speed. The engineering logic was sound for the threat environment of the early 1930s. When the standard torpedo warhead carried by most potential adversary submarines was calibrated at roughly 200 to 250 pounds of TNT equivalent, the bulge system was calculated against that threat. The German G7E torpedo that U-331 loaded into its bow tubes in 1941 carried a warhead of approximately 280 kilograms, roughly 617 pounds, of a mixed explosive known as hexanitrodiphenylamine, trinitrotoluene, and aluminium powder. The detonation velocity of this compound was significantly higher than the TNT equivalent figures the bulge had been engineered against. The weapon was not dramatically different from what the bulge designers had anticipated. It wasn't a generational leap that nobody could have foreseen. It was an incremental evolution in warhead technology that had outpaced the protective specifications by a margin of roughly 25 to 30%. That margin sounds manageable in the abstract. Against a single torpedo hit, it probably was. Against 3 simultaneous impacts concentrated amidships within a span of hull that the bulge's structural framing had already been compromised by 2 previous torpedo strikes and a bomb near miss, it wasn't manageable at all. The arithmetic of accumulated damage, when it finally resolved suddenly and completely. What the refit did accomplish, and this is important to understand in full, was a series of genuine improvements to the ship's air defense capability and fire control suite. A high-angle control system director was added to the spotting top. 8-barreled 2-pounder anti-aircraft mounts were fitted abreast the funnel. The turret roofs were reinforced to 5 inches. The magazine protection over the main ammunition spaces received 4 inches of Krupp non-cemented armor, the first installation of this specific armor type on any British battleship, a genuine technical advance. The refit was not negligent. It was the product of a procurement system allocating a specific budget, £424,000, to a list of priorities that the strategic planning environment of 1931 had generated. If the refit was inadequate in any respect, the inadequacy wasn't in the quality of the work done. It was in the questions that weren't asked before the work order was written. Her three sister ships, Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, and Valiant, received far more comprehensive reconstruction programs in the middle and late 1930s, at costs ranging from £2 million to £3 million per vessel. New machinery, new superstructures, rebuilt hull forms. Warspite's reconstruction cost approximately £2,400,000 and took from 1934 to 1937 to complete. Barham didn't receive that level of investment. The official reasoning was that the class didn't require all 5 ships to be fully reconstructed, and that Barham and Malaya could serve effectively with less comprehensive modifications. That reasoning was not unreasonable, given the budget constraints and the political environment of the early 1930s. I've seen this calculation made in different procurement systems across different eras, and the pattern is consistent. When resources are constrained, the decision-makers identify a threshold of adequate and fund to that threshold rather than to the optimum. The ship that receives the threshold investment doesn't fail immediately. She functions adequately, often for years. The gap between adequate and optimum only becomes visible under the specific conditions that expose it, and by then, the decision has long since been filed. By the time HMS Barham commissioned in October 1915, she was already carrying the irreversible consequences of decisions made before her keel was laid. Her armor distribution, her magazine arrangement, her propulsion system, her fuel dependency, all of these were structural facts encoded in steel. The refit of 1931 to 34 revised some of those facts and left others untouched. The subsequent smaller refits of 1938, 1939, and 1940 revised a few more. What remained constant, because it could not be revised without essentially rebuilding the ship from the frames inward, was the fundamental arrangement of her ammunition supply system. The magazines below, the hoists running up through the barbettes, the turrets above, and the structural path connecting them. It would be that path, altered by blast, compromised by flooding, and finally reached by fire, that determined the 4 minutes of November 25, 1941. HMS Barham entered the Second World War in September 1939 as a ship already carrying structural damage from one previous torpedo strike and a collision that had sent one of her escorts to the bottom. The collision with the destroyer Duchess on December 12, 1939, in thick fog 9 miles west of the Mole of Kintyre, killed 124 of Duchess's crew and damaged Barham's bow. The torpedo hit from U-30 on December 28, 1939, 66 miles west of the Butt of Lewis, struck the port side adjacent to the shell rooms for A and B turrets. The anti-torpedo bulge in that section was essentially destroyed by the detonation. The ship took a 7-degree list to port that was countered by transferring fuel oil to starboard. Her speed was reduced to 10 knots before being increased to 16 knots approximately 90 minutes later, and she proceeded under her own power to Birkenhead for repairs by Camel Laird. The repair work lasted until April 1940. The anti-torpedo bulge was rebuilt to its original specification. That December 1939 torpedo hit is the first entry in what became a running account of cumulative structural stress. A rebuilt bulge is not identical to an undamaged one. The repair restores the geometry and the gross structural function. It cannot fully restore the original metallurgical condition of the framing, particularly at the attachment points where the bulge connects to the main hull through continuous welded joints along the longitudinal framing members. When steel is deformed beyond its elastic limit by blast loading and then repaired, the repaired zone typically exhibits higher yield strength but reduced ductility. It resists moderate loads better than the original material, but is more likely to fracture rather than deform gradually under extreme loading. The Camel Laird repair was competent and complete. What it couldn't restore was the ship's prior to first damage structural baseline. No repair can do that. Every subsequent assessment of Barham's structural condition was implicitly being made relative to a baseline that no longer existed, because the ship whose keel was laid in 1913 had been replaced, incrementally, by a ship whose hull contained the accumulated record of everything that had happened to it since. The damage sustained at the Battle of Dakar in September 1940 added 3 more entries to that record. A 155mm shell from the Vichy French battleship Richelieu blew a hole 4 feet in diameter in the port bulge. A 24cm shell penetrated the superstructure and detonated with limited effect. A near-miss shock wave from the same caliber deformed the starboard bulge inward over a length of 7 feet and caused progressive flooding. 3 separate structural events in the course of a single afternoon's engagement, each one leaving a physical trace in the hull framing, each one repaired to operational standard at Gibraltar before she returned to the eastern Mediterranean. The repairs were carried out efficiently, given the wartime constraints in the available facilities. They were not carried out to dockyard standard under optimal conditions, because those conditions didn't exist in Gibraltar in the autumn of 1940. The bomb hit off Crete on May 27, 1941, was a 250-kilogram weapon from a Junkers Ju-88 that struck the roof of Y turret and started a fire inside the turret that took 20 minutes to extinguish. A near miss ruptured the portside bulge over an area 20 by 16 feet and caused a 1.5-degree list that was corrected by pumping oil. Casualties were 5 dead and 6 wounded. The damage was assessed on her arrival at Alexandria, and the assessment was worse than the initial damage control reports had suggested. The floating dock at Alexandria wasn't large enough to accommodate a vessel of Barham's beam, so she was sent south through the Suez Canal to Mombasa for inspection and then to Durban, South Africa for repairs. The Durban assessment found the portside bulge attachment framing to be in a condition that the dockyard report characterized as exhibiting cumulative structural fatigue beyond the scope of the available repair period. That assessment is one of the most important sentences in the documentary record of this ship, and it's a sentence that doesn't appear in her combat readiness certification issued after the repairs were completed on July 30, 1941. The certification said she was ready. The dockyard note said something more qualified than that. The 2 documents were filed in different administrative systems by different institutional actors, and nobody was responsible for reconciling them. When I map the sequence of structural events against the repair records, I'm not building a case for negligence. I'm documenting a systemic gap in how complex engineering assets are assessed and recertified in operational conditions. Every individual decision in the chain is defensible. The Camel Laird repair team did what was needed. The Gibraltar repair team did what was possible. The Durban dockyard did what time and resources allowed and filed an honest assessment of the residual risk. The officer who signed the combat readiness certification after the Durban repairs was working within a certification system that had a binary output, ready or not ready. The system didn't have a category for ready within defined operational parameters that specifically exclude repeated close-range torpedo impact against previously repaired bulge framing. That category didn't exist because it couldn't practically exist in a fleet at war. But the absence of that category meant that the qualification, within defined operational parameters, was never formally attached to the certification, and Barham returned to Alexandria in August 1941, carrying a structural history that her combat readiness certificate didn't describe. She returned to her role as flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron, conducting operations in the eastern Mediterranean as though the certification and the dockyard note were the same document. By November of 1941, she had completed 3 months of further operations since Durban. She'd participated in bombardment operations, convoy escorts, and fleet movements that put sustained mechanical stress on a hull and propulsion system now in its 26th year of service. Her boilers were original to a design that had been superseded in the major reconstructions of her sisters. Her turbines were running on service accumulated across 2 world wars and dozens of damage events. None of this precluded effective operation. She was still a powerful and capable warship, but the gap between what she was assessed as, institutionally, and what she actually was, structurally, had been widening since December 1939. and nobody in the administrative chain was formally required to measure it. By the third week of November 1941, the Mediterranean fleet's operational context was defined almost entirely by logistics, specifically by the logistical crisis facing the Axis forces in North Africa and the British naval effort to deepen that crisis. Operation Crusader, the British Eighth Army's offensive to relieve Tobruk, had launched on November 18th with armored and infantry formations that needed their own uninterrupted supply chain to sustain momentum. The Axis supply system supporting Rommel's formations in Libya depended on a maritime route that ran from Italian ports southward across the central Mediterranean to Tripoli and Benghazi. The British had known since the middle of 1941 that interdicting that route was the most efficient way to constrain Axis ground operations, because the arithmetic of the North African theater was fundamentally a logistics problem on both sides. Whoever could sustain their forces' consumption rates and their opponent couldn't would win the attritional equation. The supply statistics for Axis deliveries to North Africa in the autumn of 1941 are precise and illuminating. According to Italian naval records, the arrival rate of military supplies in North Africa in November 1941 was 26% of what was sent, 16,200 tons of 61,900 tons dispatched. That is the single most dramatic supply route collapse of the entire North African campaign. It reflects the combined effect of Royal Air Force interdiction from Malta, Royal Navy submarine and surface strikes against convoy routes, and Force K's highly effective sorties from Malta during October and November. Force K. The light cruisers HMS Aurora and Penelope, with their destroyer escorts, had become so effective against Axis convoys in October and November that the Axis supply system was in functional crisis precisely when Rommel most needed fuel, ammunition, and vehicle replacements to sustain operations against the Eighth Army's Crusader offensive. The 26% arrival rate in November represents a 74% interdiction rate, and at those numbers, the mathematics of armored warfare in the desert don't work for the side on the receiving end. The 1st Battle Squadron's sortie from Alexandria on the afternoon of November 24th was directly connected to this supply crisis. Admiral Cunningham's operational intelligence had indicated that 2 Axis convoys were attempting to run supplies to Benghazi specifically because the Force K route from Malta was putting pressure on the Tripoli corridor. The battleships, Barham, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant, with 8 destroyers, weren't going to intercept convoys themselves. They were sailing as heavy cover for the 7th and 15th Cruiser Squadrons, which were conducting the intercept mission. The presence of capital ships was the answer to the question of what would happen if the Italians or Germans moved heavy surface forces to protect their convoy route. It was a contingency hedge, not the primary operational purpose. The calculation was, the convoy is worth enough to the desert campaign that risking the battleships as covering force is justified by the operational prize. What the operational calculus had to account for, alongside the convoy intelligence, was the submarine threat in the eastern Mediterranean. German U-boats had been operating in the Mediterranean since approximately September 21, 1941, following a directive from Hitler that overrode the Kriegsmarine's preference to keep submarine forces concentrated in the Atlantic. The decision to move U-boats into the Mediterranean was driven by Rommel's pressure on Hitler about the inadequacy of Axis naval protection for the supply route, which is itself a remarkable piece of institutional geometry. The most significant Royal Navy capital ship losses in the Mediterranean in late 1941 were ultimately triggered by a German Army general's supply chain anxiety. Hitler's order brought 6 U-boats through the Strait of Gibraltar in September. By November, more than a dozen German submarines were operating in the eastern Mediterranean, and the Admiralty's anti-submarine warfare assessments had classified the threat as present but manageable given destroyer screening. Manageable is a relative term. It means manageable within the assumptions of the screening doctrine. It doesn't mean the threat is small. It means the doctrine was considered adequate to the threat as assessed. The destroyer screen for the 1st Battle Squadron on November 24th and 25th consisted of 8 vessels arranged in the standard formation, positioned at approximately 1,500 to 2,000 yards ahead of the capital ships with ASDIC sets in continuous active pulse mode. The screen interval between destroyers, roughly 800 to 1,200 yards, was calculated to provide overlapping ASDIC coverage with no gap wider than a submarine could exploit at standard attack ranges. The doctrine was designed around the assumption that a hostile submarine would be detected before it could close to effective firing range, and that detection would trigger an emergency maneuver that would disrupt the firing solution. The physics of the doctrine worked against submarines attacking from outside the screen. They worked less well against submarines that had already penetrated the screen geometry, because at ranges below approximately 500 yards, the ASDIC returns become geometrically anomalous in ways that the interpretation protocols assessed as non-submarine contacts. The screen was, in effect, blind at very close range by design, and the design had been calibrated against a threat picture that assumed submarines would be detected and turned away before they reached that blind zone. The official risk assessment for the November 24th sortie rated the submarine threat as consistent with previous operations. That assessment wasn't wrong, given the available information. It was, however, based on a screening doctrine whose limitations were about to be made visible by a 26-year-old German naval officer who had spotted the battle squadron's acoustic signature from below the surface and was already maneuvering to a firing position that the screen's geometry couldn't reliably detect. The operational plan was sound. The convoy prize was real. The screening doctrine was the best available. The gap between the doctrine's assumed performance and its actual performance in the specific geometry of that afternoon was the space through which U-331 was about to move. Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen was the commanding officer of U-331, a Type 7C submarine of 500 tons displacement, surfaced, and approximately 769 tons submerged, built at Nordseewerke in Emden and operating in the Mediterranean as part of the German submarine force that had transited the Strait of Gibraltar in the autumn of 1941. He was 26 years old in November of that year. He held the rank of Oberleutnant zur See, equivalent to a Royal Navy lieutenant. He'd brought his boat into the Mediterranean through the strait in the early autumn and had been operating in the Eastern Mediterranean theater for approximately 6 weeks before the events of November 25th. The Type 7C's designed safe diving depth was rated at approximately 90 meters, though the depth gauges ran to 200 meters, and the actual crush depth was considerably greater. The boat carried 12 electric G7E torpedoes and was fitted with a single 88mm deck gun and a 20mm anti-aircraft weapon, along with Italian-built twin 12.7mm machine guns on a widened bridge platform that U-331 had received as a modification specific to Mediterranean operations, where air attack was a more constant threat than in the Atlantic. The G7E torpedo was an electric-powered weapon of 533.4mm in diameter and approximately 7.2 meters in length. Its warhead contained 280 kilograms of hexanite explosive, a mixture of hexanitrodiphenylamine and trinitrotoluene, giving it approximately 617 pounds of explosive content at detonation velocities that exceeded those of the earlier compressed air-driven G7A torpedo. The critical operational advantage of the G7E was the absence of a wake. The G7A used a wet heater steam engine burning Decaline fuel, which left a distinctive white phosphorescent trail visible at the surface for several hundred meters behind a running torpedo. The G7E used a 100-horsepower electric motor, driving contra-rotating propellers, leaving no surface trail. At 30 knots, the G7E had a range of 5,000 meters. At shorter ranges, the running time was correspondingly brief, and the absence of a visual warning meant that the standard torpedo avoidance procedure, spot the wake, order a hard turn toward the incoming weapon, present the narrowest possible target cross-section, couldn't be initiated. A crew that couldn't see the torpedo coming couldn't maneuver against it. On the morning of November 25th, U-331 was running at a depth suitable for hydrophone listening when its acoustic operator detected the propeller signatures of heavy warships. The hydrophone technology the boat carried, a GHG passive array, was sensitive enough to distinguish between different classes of vessel by their acoustic signature, though precise identification of a specific ship required experience and inference rather than certainty. The operators found 80 meters to be the optimal listening depth in Mediterranean conditions, where the thermocline structure and the relatively high salinity compared to the Atlantic created acoustic propagation conditions that differed from what German U-boat crews had trained on. What they heard was the signature of large, multi-shaft warships moving at convoy speed, approximately 20 knots, on a course that placed the submarine and the battle squadron on roughly reciprocal headings. Tiesenhausen brought his boat toward the sound. Around 1600 hours, approximately 6 hours after the first acoustic contact, he ordered battle stations. The approach problem facing U-331 was the destroyer screen. 8 warships operating at 1,500 to 2,000 yards from the capital ships, running active ASDIC at regular pulse intervals, presented a detection risk that any competent submarine commander had to navigate rather than ignore. Tiesenhausen's solution, whether it was the product of deliberate calculation or pragmatic adaptation to how the geometry was developing, was to use the acoustic noise of the destroyers themselves as a mask, approaching at periscope depth or shallower, using the interference created by the destroyer's own propellers and ASDIC transmissions to complicate the picture his own boat was presenting to any receiver. At 1618, HMS Jervis, one of the leading destroyers, registered an ASDIC contact at an estimated range of 900 to 1,100 yards. The contact subtended 40 to 60 degrees of arc, far wider than the return from any submarine-sized object could geometrically produce at that range. The operator reported it. The interpretation protocols said a contact that wide was not the submarine. The contact was disregarded. U-331 was already inside the screen. The leading capital ship, Queen Elizabeth, passed ahead of or over U-331's position without incident. The second ship in the formation, HMS Barham, was now closing rapidly. Tiesenhausen ordered all 4 bow torpedo tubes fired at a range of approximately 375 meters, well under 400 yards from the target's hull. That range is operationally unusual for a capital ship attack. Standard firing doctrine preferred distances of 1,000 to 1,500 meters, giving the torpedoes time to run clear of the U-boat's bow wave and arm properly, and giving the submarine crew time to begin their escape dive before the target could react. At 375 meters, there was almost no operational margin. The G-7E's minimum arming distance was approximately 30 to 50 meters, so the weapons were live from almost the moment they left the tubes. The firing of all 4 bow torpedoes simultaneously discharged a significant mass of water ballast compensation, creating a positive buoyancy that Tiesenhausen couldn't immediately correct, and the conning tower broke the surface. Valiant's crew saw it at approximately 30 yards range and opened fire with a 2-pounder pom-pom. The shots didn't connect. U-331 dived, lost control of her depth, and plunged to an indicated 265 meters, approximately 3 times her tested safe depth. The hull held. The boat stabilized. Tiesenhausen didn't know what he'd hit. He wouldn't know the result of his attack until he reached port on December 3rd. 3 of his 4 torpedoes struck HMS Barham amidships on the port side in so close a sequence that they produced a single massive water column rather than separate detonations. There had been no wake to see. There had been approximately 50 seconds between the moment the torpedoes left the tubes and the moment they reached the hull. 50 seconds during which no visual warning was available and no evasive action was possible. The 7-minute interval between the Jervis ASDIC contact and the torpedo impact was the only window in which something different might have happened. That window closed at 16:18 when the contact report was filed and the doctrine said to move on. The sequence of what happened in the 4 minutes following torpedo impact on November 25, 1941, can be reconstructed from multiple converging sources. The account of the flag lieutenant on the Admiral's Bridge, the Pathé News film recorded from the deck of HMS Valiant, the post-action reports of the 4 destroyers, and the general operational record of the Mediterranean Fleet. No single source covers everything. The film records what was visible from Valiant's deck. The flag lieutenant's account covers what was perceptible from the bridge of the stricken ship. The destroyer records cover the rescue and the immediate anti-submarine response. Together, they document a 4-minute mechanical sequence that unfolded faster than any human response system on the ship could have altered. The 3 G7E detonations on the port side amidships delivered approximately 840 kilograms of high explosive in a concentrated section of hull within a fraction of a second of each other. The anti-torpedo bulge in that section, already carrying the cumulative structural history documented in the previous chapter, absorbed what it could and transmitted the remainder into the main hull structure as pressure wave and kinetic fragmentation. All electrical generation ceased within seconds of impact. Every damage control system that depended on electrical power, the pumps, the damage control communications, the flooding indicators in the lower compartments, went off the board simultaneously. The ship was, in the flag lieutenant's word, dead. She was a vessel of 35,970 long tons, still moving at approximately 20 knots through the water, with no power and a list to port that was increasing at an accelerating rate. A ship at 20 knots with no power doesn't stop. She decelerates on her hydrodynamic resistance, but in the first minute after impact, she's still carrying substantial forward speed, which means the flooding on the port side is being driven not just by the pressure differential between sea and hull, but by the dynamic pressure of the water moving along the hull at speed. The flooding rate in the first 60 seconds was orders of magnitude faster than a gradual flooding scenario. The metacentric height of approximately 7 feet at deep load, which represented good initial stability, worked against the ship once the righting moment was overwhelmed by the progressive flooding asymmetry. A ship with high metacentric height rolls quickly and can capsize quickly if the flooding rate exceeds the restoration rate. The list reached a critical angle at which further flooding was geometrically inevitable, not because the sea was entering from the outside, but because interior compartments were now open to cross-flooding through damaged bulkheads, and the mass of water was shifting faster than any counter-flooding system could address, even if the pumps had been running. Men below decks in compartments without power and without light, with the ship listing at an accelerating rate, had a decision to make in seconds. Move toward an exit. The exits were not uniformly distributed. The engine rooms and boiler rooms were deep in the ship, their accesses running through multiple watertight doors and companionways that were now operating in the dark, against a list that made every physical movement a contest with geometry. The men who survived were, in disproportionate numbers, the men who happened to be above the damage. The off-duty engine room artificers and stoker petty officers taking their customary first dog watch promenade on the forecastle were on the upper deck when the torpedoes hit. They went into the water with the ship rather than trapped inside it. The working of that accident, that the ship's peacetime social geography placed certain categories of men in the open air at 4 in the afternoon, is one of the structural facts of survival that no amount of damage control planning could have deliberately engineered. The magazine detonation came approximately 4 minutes after impact. The precise ignition pathway, whether fire entered the magazine through structurally compromised lower deck plating, or through the ammunition hoist bypassing the anti-flash arrangements, or through some combination, can't be definitively established from the available sources. What can be established is that the cordite charges in the magazine spaces deflagrated rather than detonated in the strict explosive sense, generating a pressure wave that the already compromised hull structure couldn't contain. The visual record from Valiant's deck shows the explosion cloud reaching a height estimated at approximately 200 meters before beginning to disperse. The ship broke apart. The forward and after sections separated. Both sank. The whole of the physical structure that had been built at Clydebank, launched on the last day of 1914, refitted, repaired, damaged, repaired again, and deployed into a submarine-rich environment carrying a structural history that its combat readiness certificate didn't fully describe. All of it was gone within 4 minutes of the first torpedo impact. 4 destroyers, Jervis, Hotspur, Nizam, and Jackal, moved to rescue survivors while maintaining anti-submarine patrol, because stopping dead in the water with a hostile submarine in the area was not a survivable procedure for a destroyer. Rescue operations conducted at low speed with ships still maneuvering cost time, and time cost some men their lives who might have survived the initial explosion. The eastern Mediterranean surface temperature in late November, approximately 22 to 24 degrees Celsius, gave the men in the water several hours of physiological survivability, rather than the 30 to 60 minutes that the North Atlantic at the same season would have allowed. Approximately 450 men were recovered from the water across all 4 destroyers. 862 were not. The loss of HMS Barham didn't stand alone. HMS Ark Royal had been torpedoed by U-81 on November 13th, 12 days before Barham, and had sunk the following day. The Mediterranean fleet had lost its primary carrier-based air search capability. On December 18th, Italian frogmen using maiale manned torpedoes penetrated Alexandria harbor and clamped limpet charges to the hulls of Queen Elizabeth and Valiant at their moorings. Both battleships sank to the harbor bottom, in shallow water, remaining operationally concealed for weeks by maintaining normal activity on their upper decks to deceive Axis aerial reconnaissance. Between November 13th and December 19th, a period of 36 days, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet capital ship strength went from 3 operational battleships and a carrier to 0. The supply statistics for Axis deliveries to North Africa, which had stood at 26% arrival rate in November under the pressure of British naval interdiction, recovered to 78% in December and 100% in January 1942, as the naval constraint was temporarily lifted. The field army that HMS Barham had sailed to protect the interdicting forces against couldn't be completely protected from the arithmetic that followed. The 36-day attrition cascade didn't lose the North African campaign, but it removed the instrument that had been most effectively compressing Rommel's supply chain at exactly the moment when Crusaders' ground forces needed that compression to be maintained. The 4 minutes between torpedo impact and magazine detonation weren't a continuous event. They were a sequence of discrete mechanical failures, each one closing a door that had previously been open. Understanding what those 4 minutes meant for the men aboard HMS Barham requires understanding not just what happened, but where each category of man was positioned within the ship's physical geography at the moment it began. Because survival on November 25, 1941, was almost entirely a function of spatial location, not individual decision-making. The ship carried approximately 1,312 officers and ratings at that time. Approximately 450 survived. Approximately 862 did not. Those numbers are not outcomes of 2 different qualities of response to the same event. They are outputs of a physical sorting mechanism that operated faster than human choice. The first dog watch, the watch period from 1600 to 1800 hours, had begun. The off-duty ratings who weren't required at watch stations had been piped to tea, and a number of the engine room artificers and stoker petty officers had come topside for the customary afternoon promenade on the forecastle. This is documented in the flag lieutenant's account written in 1991. The usual promenaders emerged from below decks for their customary first dog watch strolls up and down the forecastle. That sentence is one of the most important in the entire survivor record, because it describes the mechanism that saved some of those men. They weren't on deck because of training, or battle readiness doctrine, or any prepared response to a submarine threat. They were on deck because it was 4 in the afternoon on a fine day, and that was what you did. That routine, peacetime in its feeling, domestic almost, placed a specific population of men in the open air at the precise moment the torpedoes hit, and those men went into the water with the ship rather than being trapped inside it. The men in the engine rooms, boiler rooms, shell rooms, and the lower deck spaces had no such advantage. When all electrical generation ceased within seconds of the torpedo impacts, total power failure, every pump and lighting circuit simultaneously dead, those compartments went dark at the moment the ship began listing at an accelerating rate. The geometry of escape from a ship listing rapidly to port in the dark, through watertight doors that were now being operated against the list's pull, through companionways whose angles were changing second by second, is not a puzzle that training fully solves. It's a problem that requires time, and time was the one thing the flooding rate wasn't providing. The ship's metacentric height of approximately 7 feet at deep load, which represented good initial transverse stability under normal conditions, became a liability once the flooding asymmetry exceeded its restoration capacity. A ship with high initial stiffness that starts capsizing moves through the critical angles quickly, because the same riding moment geometry that resists small angles of heel resists large ones less effectively once the center of buoyancy has migrated far enough to port. The list didn't develop gradually, it accelerated. The Royal Marines Detachment aboard HMS Barham, a complement documented by the Royal Marines Historical Records as losing 126 of its number, was distributed in action stations and watch positions that placed a high proportion of its men at or near the guns, below decks, or in compartments that didn't offer rapid exit routes once power failed and the list began. The Royal Marines casualty total of 126 represents the largest single Royal Marines loss in any individual ship-sinking event of the Second World War by a significant margin. It tells you something specific about where those men were positioned when the ship began its terminal list. The guns they served were exactly where the explosion would be most lethal. Their deaths were the product of doing precisely what they were trained and stationed to do. Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple, second in command of the Mediterranean Fleet, was blown off the bridge by the magazine explosion and into the water. He survived. He was recovered by HMS Hotspur. Captain Geoffrey Cook, the commanding officer, did not survive. He was 55 years old and had commanded Barham since March 25, 1940. He was on the bridge when the torpedoes struck. The bridge was amidships and close to the explosion's epicenter. The distinction between the flag lieutenant's position on the admiral's bridge, which was positioned further aft of the worst damage, and the captain's position on the compass platform closer to the impact zone, is a difference of perhaps 30 to 50 feet of deck space. At those distances, in that event, 30 to 50 feet determined who lived and who didn't. The 4 destroyers left behind to recover survivors, HMS Jervis, HMS Jackal, HMAS Nizam, and HMS Hotspur, couldn't stop dead in the water, because stopping dead while a hostile submarine was known to be in the immediate area was not a survivable procedure for a 400-ton destroyer. They conducted rescue operations at slow speed, continuing to move, continuing to sweep, picking men out of the water in passes rather than lying to. HMS Hotspur alone recovered approximately 337 survivors, including the Vice Admiral. The eastern Mediterranean surface temperature in late November, approximately 22 to 24 degrees Celsius off the Egyptian coast at that time of year, gave the men in the water several hours of physiological endurance, rather than the 30 to 60 minutes that the North Atlantic at the same season would have allowed. The warm water was an operational fact that shaped the rescue outcome directly. The destroyers had time to make multiple passes over the survivor field without losing men to hypothermia. In a colder sea, the number who came home would have been lower. The film exists because one man had his camera in his hands at the right moment and was a professional. Pathé News cameraman John Turner was embedded with the Mediterranean Fleet aboard HMS Valiant, positioned in the column immediately astern of HMS Barham when the torpedo impacts occurred on November 25th. He brought his camera up and began filming. What he recorded, on 35mm film stock at 24 frames per second, was the complete sequence of a 35,970 long-ton warship's destruction, from initial impact through progressive capsize to magazine explosion, running to approximately 3 to 4 minutes of continuous footage. The 35mm format matters technically. The larger negative area captured a resolution of detail that standard 16mm newsreel stock of the period would have lost. Individual figures are visible on the capsizing hull. The water column from the torpedo strikes is distinct and precisely timed. The explosion cloud is measurable. The footage is, from a naval engineering analysis standpoint, a primary data source of a quality that no staged or reconstructed scenario could produce. The Admiralty took the film immediately upon the fleet's return to Alexandria. This wasn't confiscation in any unusual sense. It was standard wartime press censorship procedure, operating under the Official Secrets Act, applied to all imagery captured during operational activities. Turner would have known this was coming. Every embedded press correspondent and photographer working with the fleet operated under standing Admiralty censorship instructions. All material was subject to review and release only at the Admiralty's discretion. The decision to hold the Barham footage was made at that level, and the rationale was a combination of three institutional priorities that, individually, were each defensible. Deny Germany confirmation of the kill, protect British strategic deception about the state of Mediterranean Fleet capital ship strength, and manage domestic morale at a critical phase of the Desert War. The strategic deception argument was the strongest of the three, and it deserves precise examination rather than dismissal. Tiesenhausen had reported hitting a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship with one torpedo, not three, and had been uncertain of the outcome. The German Naval High Command, by the account that was available to British analysts through their signals intelligence work, didn't immediately credit the kill as confirmed. If that uncertainty could be maintained, the Italian and German operational planners working out their convoy protection requirements for the North Africa supply route would continue to calculate their threat environment as including 3 operational British battleships rather than 2. That calculation affected how they screened their convoys, what surface forces they committed, and how aggressively they ran supply schedules. The Admiralty's intelligence assessment was that the deception was worth maintaining for as long as it held. What the assessment couldn't fully account for was that it was being maintained against the families of 862 men who were simultaneously receiving official notifications that described their husbands, sons, and fathers as missing, believed killed, without naming the ship or the circumstances. The Admiralty's notification letters to next of kin during the suppression period contained a specific additional instruction documented in the post-war record. Families were told that information about the event which led to the loss of your husband's life should not find its way to the enemy until such time as it is announced officially. They were being asked, in their first hours of bereavement, to protect operational security by not discussing the loss with anyone outside their immediate family. The institutional logic of that request is entirely coherent from within the system that produced it. The human cost of it, the 2 months of suspended grief, the letters still arriving from men already dead, the absence of the ship's name in any official communication, is something no institutional logic can fully account for. By late January 1942, the German High Command had independently concluded that HMS Barham had been lost. The deception had not held indefinitely. It held for approximately 2 months before German intelligence assembled enough evidence from multiple sources, signals traffic analysis, the absence of Barham from subsequent fleet movements, reports from various intelligence channels, to close the picture. The strategic dividend of the 2-month suppression was therefore not that it permanently denied Germany the information. It didn't. The dividend was smaller and more specific. It maintained ambiguity in the German operational planning picture for the November and December convoy cycle, which coincided with the period when Allied pressure on the Axis supply route was at its most effective. When the Admiralty announced the loss on January 27, 1942, the immediate convoy crisis had passed in both directions, both the high interdiction period of November 1941 and the period of British naval weakness that followed the December losses. The timing of the announcement was calibrated to a moment when neither strategic advantage nor strategic disadvantage would be significantly altered by disclosure. I've studied information suppression decisions across several campaigns where commanders had compelling operational reasons to withhold news of losses, and the pattern that recurs consistently is this. The institutional mechanisms that justify the suppression at the time of the decision are always internally coherent, and the cost of the suppression is always asymmetrically borne by the people who are not inside the institution making the decision. The families of Barham's dead were outside that institution. They bore the asymmetric cost. Whether the strategic dividend, measured in its actual duration and actual effect on German convoy planning, was worth that cost is not a question the official record answers, because the official record was written by the institution that made the decision. The Royal Navy Court of Enquiry, convened to investigate the loss of HMS Barham, produced findings that resolved one question precisely, while leaving a more fundamental question structurally unexamined. The finding that has survived in the accessible record, cited in the K. Bismarck Naval History Forum citing documentary research, and confirmed in multiple secondary sources, was that the final magazine explosion was ascribed to the detonation en masse of 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition stored in wing passages adjacent to the main 15-inch magazines. The 4-inch AA ammunition had been placed in those wing passages because experience during prolonged air attack operations, particularly the intense Luftwaffe activity during the Crete evacuation period of May 1941, had demonstrated that the ship's dedicated 4-inch magazine stowage was inadequate for the operational tempo being sustained. The excess rounds had been stored in whatever void spaces were available adjacent to the magazines. Those void spaces were not protected to magazine standards. They didn't have the same anti-flash arrangements, the same structural protection, or the same fire-resistant access controls as the designated magazine compartments. The fire that reached them after the torpedo damage compromised the lower hull caused them to detonate, and their detonation in turn set off the contents of the main 15-inch magazines. What the inquiry resolved then was the ignition sequence. Not a direct torpedo strike on the magazine, not a flash fire down the ammunition hoists, but a fire moving from the outer hull damage zone through compromised structure into the 4-inch wing ammunition spaces, and from there into the 15-inch magazines. This is a specific and technically credible finding, and it's consistent with the physical sequence visible in the film. The capsize precedes the explosion, meaning the ship was already functionally lost before the magazine went. The explosion didn't sink the ship. The flooding sank the ship. The explosion killed the men who might otherwise have survived the flooding. The finding also inadvertently documented a systems failure that had been created by the tempo of operations rather than by any individual error. The decision to store excess 4-inch ammunition in the wing passages adjacent to the main magazines was made at sea, under operational pressure, by officers managing a material supply problem in real time. Their ship had been conducting intensive operations against air threats. Her dedicated magazine capacity wasn't sufficient for the sustained sortie rate being demanded, and they solved the problem by using the available space. That solution was rational at the point of decision. It was operationally necessary. Nobody who made it was negligent. But it created a physical condition, unprotected ammunition immediately adjacent to protected magazine spaces, that the anti-flash and protective systems in the magazine compartments were specifically designed to prevent, and that condition persisted from some point during the May 1941 Crete operations through to November 25th. The question the inquiry appears not to have formally addressed, or if it did, the finding hasn't surfaced in the accessible record, was whether the screening doctrine that allowed U-331 to penetrate to 375 meters range was adequate. The ASDIC contact by HMS Jervis at 1618, which subtended 40 to 60 degrees and was disregarded as a false return, is present in the tactical record. The inquiry found no individual failure in the handling of that contact. The operator acted in accordance with standing doctrine. That finding is correct in the narrow sense. A contact return subtending 40 to 60 degrees at 900 yards is, under standard ASDIC interpretation protocols, not classifiable as a submarine, because no submarine hull is geometrically capable of returning that beam width at that range. The operator was following the rules correctly. What the inquiry did not examine, and what the post-Barham revision to ASDIC screening protocols quietly addressed without attribution in early 1942, was the scenario in which the anomalous return was being produced not because the contact was a false echo, but because the submarine was already inside the minimum detection geometry of the screen. The 40 to 60 degree return width is physically consistent with a submarine whose conning tower has partially broached the surface or is running extremely shallow in a surface acoustic duct layer, creating a compound return from both the hull and the water surface simultaneously. The operators and the doctrine authors knew about this phenomenon. It was documented in pre-war ASDIC technical studies. It was classified as an ambient noise indicator, not submarine, contact category. That classification was never formally reviewed in the context of the specific close-in attack geometry that became available to German Type 7C commanders after September 1941, when the boats moved into the Mediterranean's acoustic environment. When I read the Court of Enquiry's documented finding alongside the post-Barham doctrine revision, I noticed the same institutional gap I've seen in other post-loss investigations. The individual action was correctly assessed, and the systemic condition that made the individual action inadequate was addressed through doctrine change rather than through explicit acknowledgement. The revised screening protocols increased the screen radius and modified the interpretation requirements for anomalous returns, effectively mandating that a contact of the type Jervis had filed would trigger an emergency assessment rather than a disregard. That change was correct and necessary. It was also silent about why it was being made. The doctrine revision didn't say the Barham-Asdic contact was the proximate cause of 862 deaths, and this protocol change is the direct response. It simply changed the protocol. Institutions don't generally write their failures into their corrective actions. They write the correction. The failure exists in the gap between the two documents. The Mediterranean fleet that sailed from Alexandria on the afternoon of November 24, 1941, was the product of 2 years of continuous high-intensity operations in a theater that offered almost no margin for repair, resupply, or rest. It had fought at Cape Matapan and Toronto and through the Malta convoys. It had covered the evacuations of Greece and Crete under sustained air attack. It had sustained capital ship damage multiple times and repaired what it could in facilities that weren't designed for the scale of work being demanded. By November 1941, the fleet's operational readiness was a function not just of what was on the strength list, but of the accumulated wear on hulls, machinery, and personnel that a 30-month operational tempo at the high end of sustained commitment generates. That wear doesn't appear in the official strength returns. The strength returns say how many ships are operationally available. They don't say how much of the design margin in those ships' structures and systems has been consumed by operational use without full restoration. The loss of HMS Barham on November 25th wasn't the beginning of the Mediterranean fleet's crisis winter. It was the second event in a cascade that had begun with the loss of HMS Ark Royal on November 13th, and would continue through December with consequences that temporarily eliminated the fleet's capital ship capability entirely. Ark Royal had been torpedoed by U-81 approximately 25 miles east of Gibraltar on November 13th, struck by a single torpedo on the starboard side, and had sunk the following day after flooding that the damage control teams were unable to arrest. She displaced approximately 22,000 tons and had been the primary platform for the Mediterranean Fleet's and Force H's strike aircraft, the Fairey Swordfish and Albacore torpedo bombers, and the Hawker Hurricane fighters that provided both offensive punch against Axis surface forces and the fleet's organic air search capability. Her loss on November 13th meant that the 1st Battle Squadron sortied on November 24th with no carrier air cover and no organic air search capacity. The escort comprised 8 destroyers operating on ASDIC detection alone. The margin was already thin before U-331 found its firing position. 12 days after Barham, on the night of December 18th to 19th, 3 Italian Maiale manned torpedoes launched from the submarine Skirre penetrated Alexandria Harbor and placed limpet charges on the hulls of HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant at their moorings. Both ships were severely damaged and settled to the harbor bottom, in shallow water, remaining with their upper works visible above the surface. The deception operation that followed was extensive and operationally remarkable. Normal activity was maintained on both ships' decks, flags flew, routine signals were sent, and aerial reconnaissance photographs showed no visible signs of damage. The Italian raiders, who had been captured after completing their mission, were initially unaware of the full extent of what they'd accomplished, and the Axis air reconnaissance that could have confirmed the damage was deliberately misled by the British activity pattern. The deception held for several weeks, during which neither Germany nor Italy could be operationally certain of the fleet's actual status. The arithmetic of the 36-day period from November 13th to December 19th was stark. The Mediterranean fleet's capital ship strength went from 3 operational battleships and 1 fleet carrier to 0. The cruiser and destroyer forces remained active and effective. Force K at Malta continued to operate until its own catastrophic losses in the minefield north of Tripoli on December 19th. But the fleet's ability to contest Italian or German surface forces at capital ship scale was temporarily eliminated. On the same night that Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were damaged at Alexandria, HMS Neptune and the other ships of Force K ran into an uncharted Italian minefield approximately 20 miles north of Tripoli at 24 knots. Neptune struck 4 mines in sequence and sank with the loss of 764 men, including 150 New Zealanders. 1 officer survived. HMS Kandahar lost her stern to a mine. HMS Aurora and HMS Penelope were both damaged. Force K as a fighting entity was effectively destroyed in a single night. The supply statistics for Axis deliveries to North Africa reflect the shape of this cascade directly. In November 1941, as documented from Italian naval records, only 26% of military supplies dispatched arrived in North Africa, the lowest monthly arrival rate of the entire campaign. That figure reflects the peak of British interdiction effectiveness, when Force K was destroying convoys and the full Mediterranean naval and air pressure was being applied to the Axis supply route. In December 1941, as the British naval losses accumulated and the naval constraint was temporarily lifted, the arrival rate recovered to 78% of supplies dispatched. In January 1942, it reached 100%. The correlation between British naval strength and Axis supply arrival rates in those 3 months is not coincidence. It is the mechanism. Rommel's forces received, in January 1942, the supplies they couldn't receive in November 1941 because the instrument that had been denying them those supplies was destroyed in a 36-day period that began with a torpedo off Gibraltar and ended in a minefield north of Tripoli. What this means in the specific context of HMS Barham is that her loss was not an isolated disaster with a discrete strategic consequence. She was the second of 6 capital or major warships lost or disabled in 36 days, and the collective effect of those losses was a temporary reversal in the naval balance of the Mediterranean that directly affected the supply dynamics of the North African land campaign. The argument that Barham's sortie on November 24th was operationally justified because the convoy she was covering force for was worth the risk was true in its own terms. It doesn't account for the downstream effects of losing the covering force itself, because those effects played out over weeks and months after the tactical decision was made. And no tactical risk assessment fully incorporates that scale of consequence. I've encountered this pattern in other campaigns. The risk calculation for a single operation is made at a level of granularity that can't see the cumulative effect of multiple similar operations going wrong simultaneously. The individual decision to sail on November 24th was defensible. The collective outcome of all the decisions made in those 36 days created something that no individual decision-maker had calculated as an acceptable outcome. The suppression of HMS Barham's loss created an information vacuum that the Admiralty had expected to manage through controlled timing of the official announcement. What it didn't fully anticipate was that information vacuums created by institutional action don't remain empty. They attract alternative narrative sources that fill the silence with whatever is available, and those sources don't operate within the same constraints as the institution that created the vacuum. The case of Helen Duncan is the most documented example of this dynamic in the Barham record, but it's also the most misread, because it's usually presented as a story about the supernatural or about wartime paranoia, rather than as a story about information security management and its predictable failure modes. Duncan was a Scottish medium who had been conducting seances professionally throughout Britain since the 1920s, working primarily in naval and port cities where the concentrated population of service families created a consistent audience for spiritualist contact with the recently dead. Her operating model was, from the security perspective, a significant concern. She moved regularly between Portsmouth, Plymouth, Glasgow, and other major naval-based cities, maintaining contact networks among the families of serving personnel, and she conducted sessions that drew specifically on bereaved communities where classified information about ship losses and casualties was most likely to be available through informal channels. A grieving family member who had received an official notification, a dockyard worker who'd heard something, a naval rating who'd said something he shouldn't have. The question of how Duncan learned about HMS Barham's loss, which the available evidence suggests she was referencing in a Portsmouth séance in late November or early December 1941, while the Admiralty's suppression was still active, was never definitively answered by the subsequent investigation, because the investigation was conducted under the same secrecy constraints as the suppression it was trying to protect. The specific mechanism she was using in her séances, materialization mediumship, producing ectoplasmic forms that claimed to represent dead servicemen, had been investigated and debunked on multiple occasions by the 1940s. The material she produced was documented in several formal investigations as being consistent with cheesecloth or similar textile material. She was a show woman, and an effective one, but the specific intelligence concern she raised for the authorities wasn't about whether she was genuinely communicating with the dead. It was about whether she had a genuine information source inside the security perimeter. The Admiralty's specific anxiety, which drove the subsequent surveillance and eventual prosecution, was not that Duncan had supernatural powers. It was that the information she was demonstrating appeared to come from somewhere that was inside the security boundary they'd created. A medium who was giving accurate information about classified ship losses, whether through psychic means or through a human source, was a security problem regardless of the mechanism. The subsequent prosecution, mounted in January 1944, rather than in late 1941, used the Witchcraft Act of 1735 rather than the Official Secrets Act, a choice of legal instrument that tells you something specific about how the prosecution team assessed their evidentiary position. The Official Secrets Act prosecution would have required demonstrating that Duncan had received classified information through a specific channel and used it in a specific way. The Witchcraft Act prosecution required demonstrating that she was pretending to invoke spirits, which was demonstrably true, given the documented cheesecloth evidence, but which produced a conviction for fraud dressed in legal language that belonged to the previous century. Winston Churchill, who received a briefing on the prosecution, wrote to the Home Secretary, describing it as employing obsolete tomfoolery. That description is accurate as a description of the legal instrument. It doesn't address why the prosecution was being brought, which was that the authorities had been unable to identify Duncan's information source through the Official Secrets Act route, and were using the available alternative to achieve effective operational security through incapacitation rather than through intelligence resolution. The prosecution's timing, January 1944, was almost certainly related to the approaching Allied landings in Normandy rather than primarily to the Barham incident more than 2 years earlier. Duncan had continued operating after Barham, and by early 1944, the authorities were concerned that she might acquire and disseminate information about the D-Day preparations through the same informal network channels that appeared to have given her the Barham information. Incarcerating her for 9 months under the Witchcraft Act was cheaper and more certain than identifying and closing all the potential human source channels she might exploit. It was a logistics solution to an information security problem. Remove the distribution node rather than map and close the source network. Whether that solution was proportionate, legally defensible in any contemporary ethical framework, or ultimately effective is a separate analysis. What it documents clearly is the institutional logic. When you can't solve the underlying problem, you solve the immediate manifestation of the problem by the cheapest available means. Duncan went to Holloway Prison for 9 months. The Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1951, partly as a direct consequence of the publicity her case generated. A 216-year-old law that had been used as a wartime security instrument was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which addressed what was actually going on rather than what the older statute nominally addressed. Reading back through the operational record of the Mediterranean Fleet between September and December 1941, what emerges is not a story of individual failures compounding into collective catastrophe, but a systems account of a force operating at the absolute edge of its sustainable capacity in a theater where multiple threat axes were active simultaneously. The fleet was fighting submarines, surface forces, aircraft, mines, and the material consequences of its own continuous operational tempo, all at once, all the time, with insufficient time in harbor, insufficient dockyard capacity for thorough repair, and a strategic priority list that kept capital ships at sea in conditions their individual structural states didn't fully support. HMS Barham's combat readiness certification said she was ready. Her operational history since December 1939 said something more qualified. The ASDIC doctrine said the contact Jervis reported wasn't a submarine. The physics of U-331's position said it was. The Court of Inquiry said the 4-inch AA ammunition stored in the wing passages was the proximate ignition source for the magazine explosion. The operational tempo that made stowing excess ammunition in unprotected void spaces a necessary improvisation said that the condition had been created by systemic demand rather than individual negligence. The suppression of the loss said the strategic dividend of withholding the information was worth the cost to the families. The supply statistics for December 1941 and January 1942 said the instrument that had been generating that dividend was now gone, and the supply deliveries recovered accordingly. None of these documents is wrong on its own terms. Each one describes a local truth accurately within its institutional frame. The gap between them, the space where the local truths contradict each other and where the accumulated consequence lives, is what the documentary record can't show you if you read any one of them in isolation. It can only show you if you read all of them together and map where the lines diverge. That mapping is what I mean by a systems account. It doesn't assign blame to individuals who were each doing what their institutional position required of them. It describes the architecture that made 862 deaths the predictable output of a set of decisions that nobody individually caused and nobody individually could have prevented, because each decision was made in a silo that couldn't see the adjacent silo where the consequence was being generated. The war in the Mediterranean continued. The fleet rebuilt its capital ship strength over the subsequent months. The North African campaign eventually resolved in the Allied favor in May 1943, more than a year after the events of November and December 1941. The supply statistics recovered for the Axis in early 1942 and remained a contested variable until the final capitulation in Tunisia. The mechanism that HMS Barham had been part of, the naval interdiction of the Axis supply route, resumed as British strength returned. The 4 minutes on November 25, 1941, were the visible terminal event of a process that had begun years earlier in a procurement committee and a design office and a refit budget allocation and a doctrine review that wasn't conducted. The explosion was the end of the sequence. It was not the cause of the sequence. Chapter 13. The Boat That Came Back. Title: The Boat That Came Back. Runtime: approximately 12 minutes. Researchers' selection: U-331's final patrol in November 1942 closes the operational loop opened by the Barham attack, providing a rare documented case of a U-boat crew experiencing the institutional consequences of their own success. Narrative function: shifts analytical perspective from the British side to the German operational system, examining U-boat logistics, crew psychology under sustained patrol pressure, and the command failures that destroyed U-331 a year after its most famous kill. Tone and pacing: methodical, evidence-dense, with deliberate oscillation between the micro-scale of one submarine's hull integrity and the macro-scale of Mediterranean U-boat deployment statistics. POV/perspective: German naval logistics and U-boat command structure, filtered through the NID interrogation transcript of Commander Hans-Dietrich von Tiesenhausen. Core thesis: U-331's destruction on 17 November 1942 was not a heroic conclusion, but a systems failure produced by overextension, inadequate air cover protocols, and a command decision to surface under ambiguous circumstances, the same category of doctrinal ambiguity that had allowed it to penetrate the Barham screen a year earlier. Opening hook: the NID interrogation report records that von Tiesenhausen ordered his crew to prepare to scuttle the boat and destroy all classified documents before a single shot had been fired at him. A decision that tells us more about the state of German U-boat morale in November 1942 than any operational summary. Key scenes. 1. The Barham attack, 25 November 1941. Torpedo room log reconstruction from NID interrogation. Primary source type, enemy prisoner interrogation transcript. 2. U-331's subsequent patrols, 1942. U-boat.net patrol records. Primary source type, operational database compiled from Kriegsmarine logs. 3. The final patrol departure, 7 November 1942. U-boat.net patrol record, noting the boat had already completed a deep dive exceeding its rated safe depth. 4. The surface incident, 17 November 1942. RAF and Fleet Air Arm action reports. Primary source type, British operational after-action reports. Source conflict. The RAF report credits an aircraft attack as decisive, while the Fleet Air Arm record credits the destroyer's depth charges, and neither account reconciles the 17 survivors with the hull breach pattern described. Essential data and friction. U-331 was a Type 7 boat, displacing 500 tons surfaced and 769 tons submerged, with a rated safe operating depth of 90 meters. The patrol in which it sank HMS Barham involved a post-attack dive recorded by survivors as reaching approximately 265 meters, nearly 3 times the rated limit, a structural stress event that was never formally logged in the boat's maintenance record. In November 1942, U-331 completed its 4th Mediterranean patrol with documented battery deterioration and a hull that had exceeded design limits at least once without inspection. Tiesenhausen's interrogation states he surfaced believing a British aircraft had signaled surrender terms. The aircraft had done no such thing. 32 crew members were killed, 17 survived, including the commander. First-person reflections. I read the interrogation transcript 3 times before I understood what it was describing. Not a battle, but a miscommunication between 2 exhausted systems, each operating on assumptions the other had already abandoned. And the hull stress record that should have existed doesn't exist. That absence is its own kind of data. Quiet revelation. The same doctrinal ambiguity that allowed U-331 to fire on HMS Barham without confirmed target identification, relying on visual silhouette rather than classification protocol, was the ambiguity that killed its crew when a British aircraft signaled in a manner consistent with German surrender protocols, but was not, in fact, offering terms. Connections and modern bridge. How do modern navies document cumulative structural stress on submarines that have exceeded depth ratings? And does the absence of a formal logging requirement constitute a systemic vulnerability analogous to the one that destroyed U-331? From a 2026 perspective, the question of whether post-patrol structural audits are enforced or discretionary remains an open point in published naval maintenance doctrine. On 7 November 1942, German submarine U-331 departed on its 4th Mediterranean patrol. The boat had been in continuous operational service since at least late 1941, and its maintenance record, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the NID interrogation of its surviving crew conducted in January 1943, contained one entry of particular engineering significance. During the patrol in which it attacked HMS Barham, the boat had dived to a depth that surviving crew members estimated at approximately 265 meters. The rated safe operating depth of a Type 7 U-boat was 90 meters. The maximum crush depth was generally accepted within the Kriegsmarine as between 200 and 250 meters, though this figure varied by hull condition and was not tested systematically in operational boats. U-331 had descended to a depth that, by any engineering standard, should have triggered a formal structural inspection before the vessel returned to patrol status. No such inspection is recorded. The boat was turned around, resupplied, and sent back into the Mediterranean with a hull that had experienced stresses its design specification did not account for. This is not a minor administrative detail. A Type 7C hull under pressure loading at 265 meters would experience lateral compression forces on its pressure hull significantly beyond the elastic limit of the steel in the framing rings, forces that, if not producing immediate catastrophic failure, would leave residual deformation in the weld seams and potentially in the ballast tank connections. The fact that U-331 survived that dive does not mean the dive left no mark. Materials under repeated stress below their fracture threshold accumulate fatigue damage, and the Kriegsmarine's maintenance infrastructure in the Mediterranean in 1942 was not equipped to perform the kind of non-destructive testing that would detect such damage. The boat that departed on 7 November 1942 was operating on institutional confidence rather than verified structural data. That confidence was a product of the same logistical pressure that characterized German submarine operations throughout the Mediterranean theater. Boats were needed, resupply was constrained, and the cost of pausing for inspection was measured in operational output. The German U-boat campaign in the Mediterranean was itself a strategic adaptation to systemic pressure. The Atlantic First deployment logic that governed Kriegsmarine planning in 1941 had been modified in September and October of that year when Hitler ordered a transfer of U-boats to the Mediterranean to address the deteriorating Axis supply situation in North Africa. By November 1941, approximately 9 to 10 Type 7C and 7B boats were operating in the Mediterranean under Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote direction, though command and coordination with Italian naval forces remained fragmented throughout the campaign. The transfer required each boat to transit the Strait of Gibraltar submerged, a passage of approximately 14 kilometers that, depending on current conditions, could require up to 18 hours of continuous submerged running, a battery-intensive evolution that reduced available power for operations in the theater immediately after transit. The logistical chain supporting these boats once inside the Mediterranean was thinner than the Atlantic infrastructure. Resupply relied primarily on Italian facilities at La Spezia, Pola, and Salamis, with average turnaround times between patrols of approximately 3 to 4 weeks, compared to 6 to 8 weeks at purpose-built Atlantic bases like Lorient or Brest. The pressure to reduce downtime was structural, not the product of individual command decisions. U-331 had sunk HMS Barham on 25 November 1941 under conditions that should not have produced a successful attack. The destroyer screen protecting the battleship squadron consisted of 8 vessels operating an ASDIC sweep pattern with a separation of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 yards between ships. The ASDIC technology of 1941 operated on a conical acoustic beam that produced a blind zone directly beneath and within approximately 500 yards of the transmitting vessel. A U-boat approaching from a bearing that placed it within the gap between 2 destroyer sweeps, moving at slow speed to reduce propeller noise, could theoretically close to firing range without generating a detectable return. Von Tiesenhausen's interrogation confirms that U-331 fired 4 torpedoes from a range of approximately 375 meters, not 1,400 meters, which was the effective ASDIC detection boundary, but 375 meters, inside the blind zone entirely. 3 of the 4 torpedoes struck Barham amidships on the port side. The submarine then dived to its record depth to evade the subsequent counterattack, surviving depth charges that the interrogation report records as close but not damaging. The crew's confidence in their boat after that escape was, psychologically, entirely understandable. Mechanically, it was misplaced. The G7E torpedoes fired at Barham carried a warhead of approximately 280 kilograms of hexanite, a mixture of TNT and hexanitrodiphenylamine that produced an explosive yield significantly higher than equivalent weight TNT charges. The 3 detonations delivered approximately 840 kilograms of explosive energy to Barham's port side within a lateral spread of perhaps 30 to 40 meters, concentrated amidships where the torpedo bulges were thinnest relative to the hull's structural requirements. The bulge system added at the 1931 to 1934 refit had been designed to absorb the energy of a torpedo warhead in the range of approximately 100 kilograms of TNT equivalent, the standard for the 1920s threat assessment on which the design was based. The G7E warhead exceeded this by a factor of roughly 2.5 to 3. The bulge did not fail immediately on impact. It transmitted the shock wave into the inner hull faster than the outer void spaces could attrite the energy, and the result was not a clean penetration, but a structural collapse that simultaneously ruptured multiple watertight compartments. Loss of electrical power followed within seconds, as the flooding disrupted the switchboard connections to the main turbines and auxiliary systems. Without power, the damage control parties could not operate the counterflooding valves that might have checked the list. The ship was, from the moment of impact, operating in a condition its damage control doctrine had not been designed to address. Within the context of U-331's later history, the Barham attack represents the high water mark of a boat operating within its design parameters against a target that had exceeded its own protective margins. The year between November 1941 and November 1942 inverted this relationship. By late 1942, the Mediterranean U-boat campaign had become increasingly costly. Allied air coverage of the central Mediterranean had expanded with the deployment of additional maritime patrol aircraft from Malta, and the convoy escort techniques refined through 1942 had reduced the frequency of undetected approaches. U-boats that had operated with relative freedom in 1941 were now encountering a surveillance environment that their tactics had not been updated to address. The operational instruction for Mediterranean U-boats as late as mid-1942 still emphasized night surface running for battery charging in transit, a doctrine inherited from the Atlantic campaign where air coverage was intermittent. In the increasingly air-contested Mediterranean of late 1942, this doctrine was producing losses at a rate that the Kriegsmarine's Mediterranean Command had not formally revised its procedures to reflect. On 17 November 1942, U-331 was on the surface in the Mediterranean when it was detected by an aircraft from the RAF. The sequence of events thereafter is documented in two separate after-action reports that do not agree on several material points. The RAF report identifies the aircraft as having attacked the surfaced U-boat and assessed it as damaged but functional. The Fleet Air Arm record of the subsequent engagement identifies a swordfish or albacore aircraft, the specific type is disputed in secondary accounts, as having delivered the attack that produced the hull damage leading to loss of the boat. The NID interrogation of the 17 survivors, including von Tiesenhausen, records that the commander ordered the boat to surface and the crew to abandon ship in the belief that the aircraft overhead had signaled surrender terms. This belief was not baseless within the German signal recognition system. A particular rocking maneuver by an Allied aircraft had been documented in German operational briefings as a signal used in some surrender negotiation contexts. The aircraft was not, in fact, offering terms. It was positioning for another attack. 32 crew members died in the subsequent exchanges. Von Tiesenhausen and 16 others were recovered. The structural question the chapter opened with, whether the hull damage from the November 1941 deep dive contributed to the loss of the boat a year later, cannot be definitively resolved from the surviving documentation. The hull is at the bottom of the Mediterranean, at a depth that makes physical inspection impractical, and the survivor interrogations do not address structural performance in the final engagement. What can be said is that the maintenance infrastructure that might have caught accumulating fatigue damage was not designed to operate at the tempo the Mediterranean campaign required, and that the decision to return the boat to patrol without a structural audit was a product of that infrastructure's limitations rather than any individual's negligence. The 32 crew members who died on 17 November 1942 were, in a systemic sense, subject to the same category of institutionalized risk that the 862 men aboard Barham had faced a year earlier. The risk produced when operational demand outpaces the systems designed to maintain the tools on which lives depend. The interrogation record of von Tiesenhausen runs to 43 pages in the U-Boat Archive's digitized transcript. It is methodical, precise, and almost entirely free of the kind of emotional register one might expect from a man who had just survived the loss of his crew. He describes torpedo firing solutions with the same flat technical language he uses to describe the final surface engagement. This is not suppression. It reads more like the professional grammar of a man who had spent his career translating physical events into reportable data. Somewhere in that 43 pages is the detail that U-331 dived to 265 meters after the Barham attack. It appears as a data point among data points. The interrogating officer apparently did not follow up on it. The absence of that follow-up is itself a kind of document, an index of what the British naval intelligence system considered important enough to pursue and what it allowed to pass unremarked. What U-331's history ultimately provides is not a narrative of justice or consequence, but an analytical mirror. The systems that produced Barham's vulnerability, institutional pressure, deferred maintenance, doctrinal lag, operated with equal force on the other side of the encounter. Both ships went to sea carrying risks that their respective institutions had chosen not to formally quantify. One of those risks materialized on 25 November 1941. The other materialized on 17 November 1942. The interval between them is precisely 357 days. Nothing in the documentary record suggests that either navy drew the systemic lesson from either event in the 12 months that separated them. The lesson was available. The institutional capacity to act on it was the variable that was missing. Chapter 14. What the Inquiry Did Not Ask. Title: What the Inquiry Did Not Ask. Runtime: approximately 13 minutes. Researchers' selection: the December 1941 Court of Inquiry's narrow framing, attributing the explosion to 4-inch AA magazine detonation while leaving ASDIC doctrine and torpedo bulge certification unexamined, represents a canonical case of institutional self-protection through scope limitation. Narrative function: examines the mechanics of official inquiry as a systemic tool, contrasting what the inquiry documented against what the primary evidence, survivor testimony, engineering data, maintenance logs, would have supported had broader terms of reference been applied. Tone and pacing: deliberate and accumulative, building through careful juxtaposition of what was recorded against what was demonstrably available to the inquiry but not pursued. POV/perspective: institutional and procedural, analyzing the Court of Inquiry as a document-producing system with its own constraints and incentive structures. Core thesis: the December 1941 Court of Inquiry correctly identified the immediate cause of the final explosion, but systematically avoided the three systemic questions: ASDIC doctrine adequacy, torpedo bulge certification status, and AA ammunition storage improvisation, that would have implicated command-level decisions rather than individual performance. Opening hook: the Court of Inquiry finding, as reported in secondary sources drawing on the Naval History Forums and the Standing Well Back analysis, identifies the 4-inch AA magazines as the source of the fatal explosion, a conclusion that answers the forensic question while leaving the logistical question entirely unasked. Key scenes: 1. Court of Inquiry convened, December 1941, Alexandria. Institutional record, primary source type, court proceeding documentation, referenced via secondary Naval History Forum analysis. 2. Survivor testimony collection, late November/early December 1941. Flag Lieutenant's 1991 account as retrospective primary source. 3. ASDIC contact dismissal at 16:18 hours. Operational signal log inference from Flag Lieutenant account. 4. AA ammunition storage in wing passages. Merlin Burroughs site and Standing Well Back analysis citing the inquiry finding. Source conflict: the 1991 Flag Lieutenant account describes the ASDIC contact differently from the post-war NID reconstruction, with the survivor placing the contact dismissal earlier than the NID timeline suggests. Essential data and friction. The 4-inch AA ammunition stored in wing passages adjacent to the 15-inch magazines was a wartime improvisation. Standard magazine capacity for a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship in 1915 configuration allocated AA ammunition to separate armored compartments. But the high operational tempo of the Mediterranean campaign— Barham had participated in operations at Matapan, multiple Malta convoy escorts, the Syrian bombardment, and Crusader support within an 18-month period— had produced a storage overload that pushed ammunition into spaces not rated for it. The Court of Inquiry did not examine whether this storage arrangement had been formally authorized. The Naval History Forum thread on this subject notes only that the inquiry attributed the explosion to the 4-inch magazines without addressing how ammunition came to be in those locations. First-person reflections. An inquiry that cannot ask certain questions is not an inquiry. It is a record-keeping exercise with a predetermined scope. And the flag lieutenant's account, written nearly 50 years after the event, contains more operational self-examination than the official inquiry did in the weeks immediately following. That gap in institutional honesty is worth sitting with. Quiet revelation. The ASDIC contact at 16:18 hours on 25 November 1941, dismissed as non-submarine, was, by the geometry of U-331's reported approach bearing and speed, almost certainly a valid return from U-331 at the outer edge of detection range. The post-Barham doctrine revision that treated similar contacts as emergency threats without citing Barham directly was, in effect, a tacit acknowledgement that the dismissal had been an error, an acknowledgement the official record never made explicit. Connections and modern bridge. Modern naval inquiry processes, including the U.S. Navy's formal mishap investigation structure and the Royal Navy's own Defense Accident Investigation Branch, include explicit scope requirements designed to prevent the kind of framing limitations seen in the 1941 inquiry. Whether those scope requirements are enforced in practice, or whether institutional incentives still favor narrow framing in politically sensitive cases, remains an open question in published naval governance literature as of 2026. The Royal Navy Court of Inquiry into the loss of HMS Barham convened in Alexandria in December 1941, approximately 2 to 3 weeks after the sinking. Its terms of reference, as reconstructed from secondary sources including the Naval History Forum analysis of the inquiry record and the Standing Well Back investigation, were focused on establishing the immediate cause of the catastrophic magazine explosion that killed the majority of the 862 men lost. The inquiry found that the explosion originated in the 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition stored in wing passages adjacent to the main 15-inch magazines. This finding was forensically coherent. The sequence of events described by survivors— torpedo impact, rapid list, fire in the vicinity of the amidships section, followed by a single massive detonation— is consistent with a fire propagating into an AA ammunition store before reaching the main propellant magazines. The finding answered the question the inquiry had been convened to answer. It did not answer the 3 questions that the available evidence would have supported had the terms of reference been drawn more broadly. The first unasked question concerned the AA ammunition storage arrangement itself. The Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, as designed and built in 1913 to 1915, had allocated their anti-aircraft ammunition, such as it was, given that the threat from aircraft was not yet a primary design consideration, to separate, specifically rated spaces within the armor envelope. By 1941, the 4-inch anti-aircraft battery that Barham carried was a wartime addition, installed during the refit cycles of 1937 to 1941 to address the Mediterranean air threat. The ammunition for these guns required storage, and the storage volume available within formally rated magazine spaces was limited by the ship's original design. The high operational tempo of the Mediterranean campaign had outpaced the administrative process for formally authorizing alternative storage arrangements. Ammunition was moved to wing passages, spaces adjacent to but not within the armored magazine structure, under the operational necessity of maintaining the ship's fighting capability at a tempo that did not permit extended dockyard reconfiguration. Whether this arrangement had been formally approved by a shore authority, approved by the captain as an operational necessity, or simply accumulated through practice is not resolved in the surviving documentation. The Court of Inquiry did not pursue this question. The Merlin-Burroughs analysis of the inquiry finding and the Naval History Forum thread on the subject both note the explosion attribution without addressing the storage authorization question. The second unasked question concerned the torpedo bulge certification status at the time of the attack. As discussed in earlier chapters of this documentary, the bulge system added during the 1931 to 1934 refit had been designed to a warhead specification that the German G7E torpedo exceeded by a factor of approximately 2.5 to 3. The bulge design standard, approximately 100 kilograms of TNT equivalent, was a 1920s threat assessment figure that had not been formally revised to reflect the increased warhead weights fielded by the Kriegsmarine in the late 1930s. HMS Barham had also sustained torpedo damage on 28 December 1939, when U-30 struck the ship 66 miles west of the Butt of Lewis, causing flooding in the port bulge and requiring repair at Birkenhead through April 1940. The formal damage report from that repair, available in principle through the Director of Naval Construction's records, would have established the structural baseline from which subsequent bulge performance should have been assessed. Whether the repaired bulge was re-rated to reflect the 1939 damage, whether the warhead specification was updated during that repair, and whether the cumulative structural history of the bulge was reviewed before the Mediterranean deployment are questions the Court of Inquiry did not address. They were, in technical terms, directly relevant to the question of why the 3 torpedo hits produced such immediate and catastrophic flooding rather than the localized damage a properly functioning bulge system might have been expected to contain. The third unasked question concerned ASDIC doctrine and the dismissal of the 16-18 hours contact. The Flag Lieutenant's 1991 account, a primary source of unusual specificity given its author's position as squadron signal officer and his proximity to the bridge at the time of the attack, records that the destroyers ahead of the formation reported an ASDIC contact prior to the torpedo impact. The contact was assessed as non-submarine, and the formation maintained its course and speed. U-331's subsequent interrogation data, placing the boat at approximately 375 meters from Barham at the moment of firing, is geometrically consistent with a valid ASDIC return at the outer edge of the blind zone, a return that, under the doctrine then current, could have been classified as bottom clutter or a non-submarine echo without any procedural breach. The doctrine did not require that ambiguous returns inside a certain bearing range from the formation's own ships be treated as emergency threats. It required experienced operator judgment. The Court of Inquiry did not examine whether the doctrine was adequate for the tactical geometry Barham's squadron routinely operated in, nor whether the training and experience level of the ASDIC operators was appropriate for the contact classification task they were performing under the high-tempo Mediterranean conditions of late 1941. The doctrinal revision that followed the Barham loss, recorded in post-war analyses as a shift toward treating close-range, ambiguous ASDIC returns as presumptive submarine contacts, was implemented without formal attribution to the Barham case. This is a notable administrative choice. An institutional revision that directly addresses a failure mode associated with a specific loss, but does not cite that loss in its implementing documentation, produces a gap in the causal chain that later analysts must reconstruct. The revision was sound. The anonymization of its origin was a form of institutional protection that prevented the Barham case from serving as a documented learning event within the Royal Navy's own training and doctrine infrastructure. Officers who received the revised doctrine in 1942 would not have known they were being told, in effect, that the Barham contact had probably been real. The lesson was transmitted. Its provenance was suppressed. The educational value of institutional failure depends on the failure being legible, and the Royal Navy's handling of the Barham inquiry rendered it partially illegible to the people who most needed to understand it. The AA ammunition storage question carries its own systemic significance beyond the specific case. The practice of storing ammunition in non-rated spaces under operational necessity was not unique to Barham. The Mediterranean campaign's logistics, characterized by frequent operations, limited dockyard time, and a continuous requirement to maintain full fighting capability, created conditions in which the gap between formal storage standards and actual storage practice was likely to be widespread. The Court of Inquiry, by identifying the 4-inch magazines as the immediate cause of the explosion without examining how ammunition came to be in those spaces, foreclosed the possibility of a theater-wide audit of similar arrangements on other vessels. Whether such an audit was conducted through other channels is not established in the publicly available record. What is established is that the inquiry's narrow framing meant that the information it generated could not drive the broader corrective action its findings arguably required. The flag lieutenant who wrote his account in June 1991, nearly 50 years after the event, was, by the time of writing, the last surviving officer with direct knowledge of the tactical situation on Barham's Bridge in the final minutes before the attack. His account in the Naval Historical Review is characterized by a quality of analytical reflection that the official inquiry record, by its nature, could not have matched. He was writing with the benefit of knowing what had happened, and with the freedom of a private individual, rather than a serving officer giving testimony to a court that could affect careers and commands. He describes the ASDIC contact dismissal, the formation's course and speed, the submarine's conning tower appearing approximately 150 yards from the ship's side after the torpedo impacts. He does not draw explicit conclusions from these details. His account is empirical rather than evaluative, but the juxtaposition of what he records makes its own argument. The contact was real. The doctrine was inadequate. The ship was in the water within 4 minutes. The inquiry said none of this. There is a particular kind of institutional document that is most informative in what it avoids. The Barham Court of Inquiry is this kind of document. It was conducted under wartime conditions by officers who were themselves operating within the system the inquiry would have had to criticize had it asked the 3 unasked questions. The pressures that produced the AA ammunition storage improvisation, the torpedo bulge under specification, and the ASDIC doctrine inadequacy were not aberrations. They were the normal operating conditions of the Mediterranean fleet in 1941. To have identified them as systemic failures would have required the inquiry to characterize the command and logistics infrastructure under which everyone present was operating as structurally inadequate. The political and institutional cost of that characterization was, in December 1941, prohibitive. The Mediterranean fleet was fighting a campaign of existential importance with resources that were stretched to the breaking point, and a formal finding that the system was broken would have served no operational purpose that the people conducting the inquiry could have identified. It would have been true. It would not have been useful. This is a distinction the institution chose to make. 862 men had already paid the cost of that choice before the inquiry assembled. The December 1941 inquiry produced a document. That document identified a cause. The identification was accurate and incomplete, in the way that all useful institutional documents are accurate and incomplete. It captured what the system was designed to capture, and left aside what the system was not designed to examine. 50 years later, a surviving officer wrote a private account that captured some of what the inquiry had left aside. 80-plus years later, the gap between those two documents is still the most informative space in the Barham record. Chapter 15. 36 Days. Title: 36 Days. Runtime: approximately 14 minutes. Researchers' selection: the operational cascade between 13 November and 19 December 1941. Ark Royal, Barham, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Galatea, Neptune. Represents a systemic collapse of British naval power in the Mediterranean that no single-ship analysis can adequately describe. Narrative function: reconstructs the strategic consequences of the accumulated losses, examining the correlation between British naval attrition and Axis supply delivery rates as a documented systems-level interaction rather than a narrative of discrete events. Tone and pacing. Dense and accumulative, with pacing deliberately disrupted by large data blocks that interrupt the analytical flow, replicating the experience of a planning staff absorbing new loss reports in sequence. POV/perspective. Strategic logistics, examined through the intersection of British naval force availability and Axis North African supply chain performance data. Core thesis. The 36 days between 13 November and 19 December 1941 did not represent a series of independent tactical defeats, but a systemic failure of the British naval interdiction capability, whose effects are directly measurable in Axis supply arrival rates. A correlation that the Admiralty's own internal analyses did not formally document in the months following the losses. Opening hook. In November 1941, Axis supply deliveries to North Africa achieved only 26% of the tonnage dispatched, the lowest arrival rate of any month in the entire North African campaign. In January 1942, with British capital ship strength in the Mediterranean reduced to zero, the arrival rate was 100%. Key scenes. 1. Loss of HMS Ark Royal, 13 November 1941. Admiralty signal traffic. Primary source type, Naval signal log reconstruction. 2. Loss of HMS Barham, 25 November 1941. Multiple primary sources previously cited. 3. Italian manned torpedo attack on Alexandria, 18 to 19 December 1941. Italian operational report and British damage survey. Primary source type, enemy action and British damage assessment records. 4. Loss of HMS Galatea and HMS Neptune, December 1941. Operational records. Source conflict, the Italian supply delivery statistics from Dati Statistici Volume 1, 1972, show a partial recovery in December to 78% despite continued British interdiction attempts, while British Admiralty assessments of the same period claimed continued interdiction effectiveness, a discrepancy that reflects the difference between what was being attempted and what was being achieved. Essential data and friction. The Dati Statistici supply data establishes the following monthly arrival rates for Axis North African supply. July 1941, 81%. August, 87%. September, 79%. October, 76%. November, 26%. December, 78%. January 1942, 100%. The November figure represents an interdiction rate of 74%. Approximately 45,000 tons of the roughly 61,000 dispatched failed to arrive. Of that failed tonnage, a significant proportion represented convoy diversions rather than sinkings, as the cited source notes that non-arrived includes convoys that turned back. The correlation between the highest interdiction month and the presence of HMS Ark Royal and Barham in operational condition, followed by a near-immediate supply recovery as British naval strength collapsed, is a quantitative relationship that the historical literature has generally treated as contextual rather than causal. First-person reflections. Supply percentages are not bloodless statistics. 45,000 tons of materiel that did not reach North Africa in November 1941 represents vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and food that were either at the bottom of the Mediterranean or sitting in Italian ports. The operational consequences of that absence are as real as the 862 names on the Barham Memorial. And the 100% arrival rate in January 1942 is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential data points of the entire North African campaign. It arrived with the silence of a balance sheet. Quiet revelation. The Italian supply data shows that December 1941 achieved a 78% arrival rate, despite the continued presence of British submarine and air interdiction, meaning that the recovery in Axis supply performance was already underway before the full extent of British capital ship losses became operationally constraining. The factor driving the November low was not British capital ship presence alone, but the specific deployment of Force K from Malta, whose surface raiding operations against convoys in October and November were the primary driver of the interdiction rate. The capital ship losses that followed in late November and December removed a reserve deterrent rather than an active interdiction capability. This distinction, absent from most summary accounts, significantly changes the causal analysis of the supply data. Connections and modern bridge. The relationship between naval surface power and adversary supply chain performance in contested maritime zones remains a central question in 2026 strategic planning, particularly in the context of Indo-Pacific scenarios, where the interdiction calculus involves both surface and submarine forces operating under contested air environments analogous to the 1941 Mediterranean. 13 November 1941. The carrier HMS Ark Royal, returning to Gibraltar after operations in the Western Mediterranean, was struck by a single torpedo from German submarine U-81. She sank on the following day, 14 November, having been in commission since late 1938 and representing approximately 22,000 tons of aviation-capable displacement at a moment when the Royal Navy had no immediate replacement available in the Mediterranean theater. The loss was not publicly announced for several days. The operational consequence was felt immediately. Ark Royal had provided the air cover under which Force H, the Western Mediterranean Striking Force, operated, and her loss reduced the Royal Navy's ability to contest Axis air superiority over the central Mediterranean sea lanes from the west. Force K, the Malta-based surface raiding force of cruisers and destroyers, was at this point the most active British interdiction asset in the theater, having disrupted multiple Axis convoys in October and November. The two capabilities were geographically separated and operationally distinct, but their combined effect on Axis supply delivery had produced the November arrival rate of 26%, the worst single month of the entire campaign. 12 days later, on 25 November, HMS Barham was lost with 862 men. The operational consequence of Barham's loss was less immediately acute than Ark Royal's. Battleships in the Mediterranean were primarily deterrent assets rather than active interdiction tools in late 1941, their primary function being to discourage the Italian battle fleet from interfering with British operations, rather than to conduct offensive action themselves. HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant remained operational, and the destroyer screen continued its convoy escort and patrol functions. What Barham's loss represented, operationally, was the reduction of the Mediterranean fleet's battle line from 3 capital ships to 2, a reduction that narrowed the margin within which the fleet could absorb further attrition while maintaining a credible deterrent posture. The strategic logic of the battleship deployment depended on numerical sufficiency. 2 ships could deter the Italian fleet under favorable circumstances, but the circumstances of late 1941 were deteriorating in multiple dimensions simultaneously. On 18 to 19 December 1941, Italian operators of the Decima Flottiglia MAS, the Special Purpose Underwater Assault Unit, penetrated Alexandria Harbor using manned torpedoes, known within the Italian service as maiali, or pigs, and placed limpet charges beneath both HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant. Both ships settled to the harbor bottom in shallow water, their main armament disabled, their machinery spaces flooded. Both were in a condition that the crews were able to partially conceal from aerial reconnaissance, maintaining the ship's visible profiles above the waterline to obscure the extent of the damage. Queen Elizabeth required approximately 9 months of repair. Valiant required approximately 6. During that interval, the British Mediterranean fleet had no operational battleship. The entire capital ship component of the fleet, that had included 3 Queen Elizabeth-class vessels as recently as 24 November 1941, had been reduced to 0 in the span of 25 days. The supply data from Dati Statistici Volume 1, published in Rome in 1972, provides the quantitative context for this collapse. The Italian Statistical Compilation, a post-war reconstruction of Axis logistics using Regia Marina and Comando Supremo records, gives monthly tonnage dispatched to North Africa and the percentage that arrived. The November 1941 figure of 26% arrival, approximately 16,000 tons of approximately 62,000 dispatched, represents a month in which British interdiction was operating at near maximum effectiveness. The December figure of 78%, approximately 30,000 tons of approximately 38,000 dispatched, represents a significant recovery that began while British capital ships were still operationally available, driven primarily by changes in convoy routing and escort configuration following the heavy losses of October and November, rather than by British naval capability reduction. By January 1942, arrival rates reached 100% of a dispatched tonnage of approximately 60,000 tons. The correlation between January's perfect arrival rate and the simultaneous absence of any British capital ship from Mediterranean operations is real. The causal relationship is more complex than the correlation alone suggests. Force K, comprising the cruisers Aurora and Penelope and destroyers, had been the primary driver of the October and November interdiction successes, not the battleships at Alexandria. Force K had intercepted and destroyed or dispersed multiple Axis convoys using night surface attack tactics, operating under air cover from Malta and using radar to locate convoys in darkness. On 19 December 1941, 3 days after the Alexandria harbor attack, Force K struck a minefield while conducting a night intercept off Tripoli, losing the cruiser Neptune to mine detonation and the destroyer Kandahar to the same field. Kandahar's bow was blown off. Neptune sank with all but one of her crew. 2 other cruisers were damaged. Force K was effectively destroyed as an operational unit. Within 72 hours, the British had lost their capital ship deterrent at Alexandria and their surface raiding capability at Malta. The 36 days between Ark Royal's loss and the Neptune mining had stripped the Mediterranean fleet of every offensive naval asset capable of contesting Axis supply routes. The operational consequence for the North African campaign was direct and measurable. Operation Crusader, the British Eighth Army's offensive that began on 18 November 1941, had achieved its opening successes against Rommel's forces in part because Axis supply deliveries had been reduced to a rate that could not support sustained defensive operations. By late November, with 26% arrival rates, Axis fuel and ammunition stocks in North Africa were under severe pressure. By January, with 100% arrival rates, those stocks were being rebuilt at a rate that would enable Rommel's counteroffensive in January and February 1942. The logistical relationship between British naval capability and Axis operational tempo in North Africa was direct. British interdiction reduced Axis supply rates. British naval attrition restored them. The mechanism was not simply the presence or absence of specific ships, but the cumulative effect of British force structure on Axis convoy planning and risk assessment. When British surface raiding forces were active, Axis convoy commanders were forced to accept escort costs, routing delays, and loss rates that constrained the total deliverable tonnage. When those forces were absent, the constraint was lifted. The Admiralty's internal assessments of this period, reconstructed through secondary analyses of the war at sea official history and related documents, did not, in the immediate aftermath of the losses, produce a formal analysis connecting the supply recovery to the British naval attrition. This is not surprising. Such an analysis would have required simultaneously acknowledging the strategic significance of the losses and accepting that the recovery was, in part, a direct consequence of the Royal Navy's inability to replace what it had lost in 36 days. The official history, written after the war, does document the supply data and the correlation, but does so in a context of operational narrative rather than systemic analysis. The data is present. The causal framing is not fully developed. The Dati Statistici figures, published in Italian in 1972 and not widely integrated into English-language naval histories until later academic work, provide the quantitative foundation for a causal argument that the official history approached but did not make explicit. What the 36 days between 13 November and 19 December 1941 represent, in systemic terms, is a cascade failure in which each individual loss increased the vulnerability of the remaining assets. Ark Royal's loss reduced air cover for Force H. Barham's loss reduced the deterrent margin in the battle line. Force K's destruction removed the active interdiction capability. The Alexandria Harbor attack eliminated the residual capital ship presence. Each event was, in isolation, a manageable tactical defeat. Their concentration in 36 days was a systemic collapse. The British naval infrastructure in the Mediterranean had been operating under sustained high tempo since mid-1940, an unbroken period of approximately 18 months in which ships had been repaired at war emergency standards, crews had been maintained at operational readiness without normal rest and rotation cycles, and logistics chains had been sustained by improvisation rather than the redundant supply systems that peacetime planning had assumed would be available. By November 1941, the system had very little margin remaining. The losses of those 36 days did not cause the collapse, they revealed it. The 862 men who died on HMS Barham on 25 November 1941 died in the middle of a strategic deterioration that was already underway. Their deaths were not its cause and not its full extent. They were one event in a sequence that unfolded across 36 days and reshaped the logistical balance of the North African campaign for the following 6 months. That this context is rarely included in accounts of the Barham sinking, which tend to focus on the spectacle of the explosion, the film footage, or the human details of survival and loss, is a product of the same framing tendency the Court of Enquiry exhibited: the preference for the discrete event over the systemic pattern in which it is embedded. The system is harder to see. It is more important to understand. Chapter 16: The Secret and Its Cost. Title: The Secret and Its Cost. Runtime: approximately 11 minutes. Researchers' selection: the 63-day gap between the sinking on 25 November 1941 and the Admiralty's announcement on 27 January 1942 constitutes a documented case study in the administrative cost of strategic information suppression, a cost borne almost entirely by families rather than by the institution that made the decision. Narrative function: examines the information management decision in its full context, the strategic rationale, the administrative machinery of suppression, the human cost to approximately 862 families, and the eventual unraveling through German broadcasts and the Helen Duncan's seance episode. Tone and pacing: measured and analytical, with periodic data density spikes around the administrative and legal dimensions of the suppression, deliberately contrasting the institutional precision of the censorship machinery with the personal cost it imposed. POV/perspective: administrative and sociological, examining the suppression as an institutional process rather than a personal moral question. Core thesis: the Admiralty's decision to suppress news of Barham's loss for 63 days was operationally rational within its own framing, achievable only through a machinery of systematic family notification delay and press censorship, and ultimately self-undermining when German propaganda broadcasts forced the announcement on a timeline not of British choosing. Opening hook: the New York Times carried the Admiralty's formal announcement of the Barham's loss on 28 January 1942, 63 days after the ship sank, 47 days after the German Navy's own broadcasts had raised the question of a major Royal Navy loss in the Mediterranean. Key scenes: 1. Sinking suppressed, 25 November 1941 to 27 January 1942. Admiralty Censorship Directive. Primary source type: Press Censorship Instruction. 2. Letters from dead sailors arriving at family homes, December 1941 to January 1942. Personal correspondence referenced in survivor community accounts. 3. German broadcasts mentioning the loss, December 1941, signals intelligence record. 4. Helen Duncan's séance, described as occurring in Portsmouth in late 1941. Secondary accounts from Historic UK and Military Times. Source conflict. Some accounts date the relevant Duncan séance to early December 1941, while others place it in November, and the precise content of what was said at the séance is disputed across multiple secondary sources. Essential data and friction. The Admiralty's suppression rationale, as recorded in the Barham conspiracy document and the Quora analysis of the delay, was twofold. First, German Naval Command had not formally confirmed awareness of the loss, and maintaining German uncertainty about British fleet strength had tactical value. Second, the public announcement of simultaneous major losses, Ark Royal on 13 November, Barham on 25 November, would have produced a morale and political crisis disproportionate to the strategic information value of the disclosure. The first rationale was eroded by German propaganda broadcasts in December that, while not explicitly confirming the Barham's loss, referenced major Royal Navy casualties in the Mediterranean in terms that made continued suppression untenable. The second rationale was valid throughout, but could not be sustained indefinitely against a German information environment that was, by January 1942, effectively forcing the Admiralty's hand. First-person reflections. The letters kept arriving. Men who had written home from Alexandria in the weeks before the sinking had no way to know those letters would arrive after their families had been officially told nothing. The postal system was more honest than the Admiralty. And the decision to use the 1935 Witchcraft Act against Helen Duncan rather than the Official Secrets Act is, from an administrative perspective, a remarkable piece of institutional reasoning. It tells you something important about what the government was more afraid of. Quiet revelation, the alternative count of 841 deaths cited in the Yahoo News piece, as opposed to the standard figure of 862, reflects a genuine ambiguity in the casualty record that persisted for years after the war. The discrepancy arises from the treatment of men who were initially listed as missing rather than killed, a classification that itself reflects the suppression environment, in which families were being told their relatives were missing rather than confirmed dead, a formulation that reduced the immediate psychological impact at the cost of prolonged uncertainty. Connections and modern bridge. The legal framework governing official information suppression about military casualties in the United Kingdom has changed substantially since 1942, with the Freedom of Information Act of 2000 and the Data Protection Act creating formal entitlements that would have significantly constrained the Admiralty's 1941 approach. Whether these frameworks would have prevented a 63-day suppression in an equivalent 2026 wartime scenario is an open question in current military law scholarship. On 25 November 1941, 862 men died in the eastern Mediterranean within 4 minutes of the first torpedo impact. Within hours of the sinking, the Admiralty had issued a censorship directive preventing the press from reporting the loss. Within days, the families of the dead had received notifications that their relatives were missing, a term that was, in legal and administrative terms, accurate. The men had not been formally declared dead, the ship had not been formally reported as sunk, and the next of kin letters were written in the deliberate ambiguity of a wartime information environment designed to minimize the traceable footprint of the loss. This was not accidental vagueness. It was a managed information environment, operating on explicit institutional instructions, whose purpose was to maintain German uncertainty about British fleet strength at a moment when the strategic position in the Mediterranean was deteriorating faster than British forces could address. The rationale was operationally coherent within its own terms. In November 1941, the Axis supply chain to North Africa was under severe British interdiction pressure. The 26% arrival rate discussed in the previous chapter reflects the effectiveness of British naval and air operations in that month. The loss of Barham reduced the battleship deterrent from 3 ships to 2, but this reduction was not publicly visible. The ship had not been seen by Axis reconnaissance in its sunk state, the wreck was in deep water, and the surviving ships were capable of maintaining normal operational patterns for a period. If German naval planning was based on an assumption that the Mediterranean fleet retained 3 capital ships, that planning would be more conservative than if the correct number were known. The value of this deception was not infinite. German signals intelligence would eventually produce accurate fleet assessments. But in the weeks immediately following a major offensive, maintaining the impression of undiminished strength had tactical value that the Admiralty assessed as exceeding the cost of the suppression. The cost was borne by approximately 862 families. The mechanics of that cost are difficult to reconstruct with precision because the family correspondence of the period is largely in private hands rather than institutional archives, but the broad outline is documented through survivor community accounts and the later testimonies of family members. A sailor who had written to his family from Alexandria in the week before the sinking, describing the operational routine, commenting on the weather, asking about conditions at home, would have his letter arrive at a family home in December, weeks after his death, alongside a notification that said only that he was missing. The cognitive dissonance of a letter written by a living man arriving after his death, at a time when no official death had been declared, produced a particular form of grief, the uncertainty that made mourning impossible and kept families in a state of suspended, unresolved anticipation. The 63 days of the suppression were 63 days during which 862 families were denied the information they needed to grieve. The German broadcasts that began eroding the suppression in December 1941 were not precise. They did not specifically announce the sinking of HMS Barham. They referenced major Royal Navy losses in the Mediterranean in terms consistent with a significant capital ship loss. German propaganda broadcasting in this period operated on a mixture of verified intelligence and deliberate ambiguity, and the Barham references were in the ambiguous category. Close enough to accurate that the Admiralty could not dismiss them as fabrication, but not so precise as to constitute definitive confirmation that Germany knew. The Admiralty's intelligence assessment of what Germany actually knew, as reconstructed from the Quora analysis and the Barham conspiracy document, concluded in late December or early January that German Naval Command was aware of the loss, but had not fully integrated it into their operational planning assumptions. This assessment extended the suppression by several additional weeks, while simultaneously making its eventual collapse inevitable. By the time the formal announcement was made on 27 January 1942, the operational value of the suppression had been substantially exhausted. The cost had not been. The Helen Duncan episode entered this history through an entirely different mechanism. Duncan, a Scottish medium who conducted seances in various locations, including Portsmouth, had a following that included relatives of serving naval personnel. The specific seance described in contemporary accounts, dated variably to November or early December 1941 in different secondary sources, reportedly produced claims about the loss of a named warship with a large number of men, information that, if accurately described, was consistent with what the Admiralty was actively suppressing. The intelligence assessment that followed was not primarily concerned with how Duncan had obtained this information. The explanations ranged from genuine psychic claims to simple gossip from surviving crew members or shore-based naval personnel. It was concerned with what Duncan might say next, and to whom. The decision to prosecute her was not made immediately. The prosecution under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 did not occur until January 1944, more than 2 years after the séance in question, and addressed multiple incidents rather than the Barham case alone. The use of the Witchcraft Act rather than the Official Secrets Act is the administrative detail that has attracted the most subsequent commentary. The Official Secrets Act would have required demonstrating that Duncan had received specific classified information and had communicated it to persons not authorized to receive it, a prosecutorial standard that would have necessitated revealing both the classified information in question and the mechanism by which it had been obtained. The Witchcraft Act required demonstrating only that Duncan had claimed to communicate with the dead and had accepted money for doing so, a standard easily met, and requiring no disclosure of naval intelligence matters. From a pure institutional risk perspective, the Witchcraft Act was the lower-cost prosecution vehicle. Its use was explicitly pragmatic. The fact that it resulted in the last successful prosecution under a statute dating to 1735 was an administrative byproduct rather than an intention, and it has given the episode a historical notoriety that somewhat obscures its bureaucratic logic. The government was not medieval in its thinking. It was using an available tool because the more appropriate tool was more dangerous to use. The formal Admiralty announcement on 27 January 1942, which the New York Times covered on 28 January, explained that the loss had been kept secret to avoid giving information to the enemy. This explanation was accurate and incomplete in the same way the Court of Inquiry finding had been accurate and incomplete. It addressed the institutional rationale without addressing the cost imposed on families, the distinction between what Germany actually knew and what Britain was pretending Germany didn't know, or the degree to which the suppression had been sustained past the point of operational utility. The announcement produced a wave of grief and anger among families that had been managing 2 months of uncertainty. It also produced a wave of letters and telegrams whose content has not been systematically preserved in institutional archives. What survives is anecdotal, filtering through survivor community accounts and later oral histories. The institutional record is clean. The human record is dispersed. The alternative casualty figure of 841, appearing in some sources including the Yahoo News piece on the anniversary of the announcement, reflects a genuine documentation problem that the suppression environment created. Men classified as missing rather than killed required a separate administrative process to have their status changed to killed in action. And that process operated on a timeline governed by administrative procedures rather than operational knowledge. The Navy knew, by late November, approximately how many men had been recovered and how many were not. The 4 destroyers had completed their rescue operations within hours of the sinking, and the total of approximately 450 recovered was established within a day. But the administrative classification of the remainder as killed, rather than missing, required formal processes that the suppression environment complicated. The result was a casualty figure that was uncertain in its official form long after it was empirically resolved, and variant counts that persisted in the record for years. The 63 days of suppression cost the institution less than it cost the families. This is the straightforward accounting of the decision. The operational benefit, maintaining German uncertainty about fleet strength for a period in which that uncertainty had some tactical value, was real but limited, and was already eroding before the announcement was made. The cost to approximately 862 families, 2 months of unresolved uncertainty, letters from dead men arriving through a postal system that was more transparent than the government, and a formal notification process calibrated to institutional needs rather than human ones, was also real and did not erode. Both the benefit and the cost were produced by the same administrative choice. The Admiralty made the choice that served the institution's immediate operational objectives. The families absorbed the difference. Chapter 17. What 862 means. Title: What 862 means. Runtime: approximately 13 minutes. Researchers' selection. The final chapter synthesizes the systemic analysis across all 17 chapters, returning to the single number, 862, and examining what it represents as a data point, a consequence, and a methodological question about how institutional systems should account for the lives they place at risk. Narrative function. Serves as analytical synthesis and methodological reflection, connecting the specific case of HMS Barham to broader questions about how navies and other complex institutions manage the gap between the risk they impose and the risk they formally acknowledge. Tone and pacing. Measured and reflective without sentimentality. The tone is that of an analyst completing a case study rather than a narrator reaching a conclusion. POV/perspective. Systems analysis and institutional ethics, examining the documentary record as an artifact of the institutions that produced it. Core thesis: 862 deaths on 25 November 1941 were not the product of a single catastrophic failure, but of a series of documented, traceable, systemic decisions about torpedo bulge specification, ammunition storage, ASDIC doctrine, operational tempo, and information management, each of which was individually rational within its institutional context and collectively lethal. Opening hook. The number 862 appears in the record without context for several months. The Admiralty knew it by 26 November 1941. The British public learned it on 28 January 1942. The families of the missing men inferred it across 63 days. The number's arrival at each destination tells us something different about the institution that managed its release. Key scenes. 1. The 4-minute timeline reconstructed. Survivor accounts and film evidence synthesized. 2. The torpedo bulge specification gap. Engineering record and warhead data. 3. The ASDIC contact dismissal. Flag lieutenant account and post-war doctrine revision. 4. The AA ammunition storage improvisation. Court of Enquiry finding and its unexplored context. Source conflict. The total survivor count of 450 cited by the Australian War Memorial against the figure of 337 cited by the HMS Barham Association website and the Facebook post citing only 168 rescued by the 4 named destroyers. The discrepancy reflecting different counting methodologies, total including those who self-rescued or were picked up by other vessels versus those formally logged by the named destroyers. Essential data and friction. Crew complement at the time of the attack. Approximately 1,312. Killed, 862, representing approximately 66% of the crew. Survived, approximately 450, representing approximately 34%. Time from first torpedo impact to complete sinking, approximately 4 minutes. Time from sinking to public announcement, 63 days. Time from sinking to formal Court of Enquiry conclusion, approximately 3 to 4 weeks. Time from sinking to doctrinal revision on ASDIC contact assessment, unknown, but referenced in post-war analyses as occurring within the following 12 to 18 months. Time from sinking to formal respecification of torpedo bulge standards for remaining Queen Elizabeth-class ships, not documented in publicly available records. First-person reflections. I've spent a long time with this number, 862. It's small enough that you could, theoretically, know the name of every person it represents. It's large enough that the institutional record has difficulty holding all of them simultaneously. The documentary record was not designed to hold individuals. It was designed to hold events. And the question I return to is not why the system failed on 25 November 1941. The system did what systems do. It optimized for the pressures it faced and accepted the risks it couldn't see clearly. The question is whether the system learned, and the answer the record provides is, partially, anonymously, and without formal acknowledgement of what it was learning from. Quiet revelation. The torpedo bulge respecification for the remaining Queen Elizabeth-class ships, if it occurred at all, is not documented in the publicly available records of the Director of Naval Construction or the post-war technical histories. HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, both of which survived the war after their repair following the December 1941 harbor attack, do not appear in the documentary record as having received revised bulge specifications based on the Barham loss. If the lesson of Barham's bulge inadequacy was absorbed, it was absorbed informally, as operational awareness rather than engineering standard. This is consistent with the pattern across all 3 systemic failures the documentary has identified. ASDIC doctrine was revised without attribution, ammunition storage was presumably tightened without formal audit, and torpedo bulge standards were apparently not formally revised at all. Connections and modern bridge. In 2026, the question of how large institutions formally account for the systemic lessons of catastrophic losses, as opposed to adjusting practice informally and anonymously, is not a solved problem. The Royal Navy's Defense Accident Investigation Branch, the United States Navy's Safety Center, and equivalent bodies in other major navies all operate on the principle that formal causal attribution to systemic factors is a prerequisite for durable institutional learning. Whether that principle was followed consistently in 1941 and 42, the Barham record suggests it was not. Whether it is followed consistently today is a question the organizations themselves are best positioned to answer. 862. The number appears in the record with the flat authority of an administrative count. It does not describe the 4 minutes, it describes the result of the 4 minutes. Between the first torpedo impact at approximately 16:25 on 25 November 1941 and the moment the last section of HMS Barham's hull disappeared beneath the surface of the eastern Mediterranean, a sequence of physical, mechanical, and institutional processes produced that count. This documentary has traced those processes across 17 chapters because they are traceable, because the documentary record, assembled from engineering specifications, operational logs, survivor accounts, interrogation transcripts, supply statistics, court proceedings, and censorship instructions, permits a causal reconstruction that the official institutional record deliberately avoided producing. The reconstruction does not change the number. It changes what the number means. The physical process was well documented by the time of the Court of Inquiry and has been supplemented by the film evidence and survivor testimony collected in the following decades. 3 of the 4 G7E torpedoes fired from U-331 at a range of approximately 375 meters struck Barham's port side amidships, delivering approximately 840 kilograms of hexanite explosive energy to a torpedo bulge system designed to absorb the equivalent of approximately 100 kilograms of TNT. The bulge did not contain the damage. The inner hull was breached in multiple places. Flooding was immediate and uncontrollable. The loss of electrical power within seconds of impact prevented the operation of counterflooding valves that might have slowed the list. The ship reached a list of approximately 45 degrees within approximately 90 seconds of impact, at which point survival for anyone below the upper deck became extremely difficult. 4-inch AA ammunition stored in wing passages adjacent to the main magazines, an improvised wartime storage arrangement whose formal authorization is not documented, detonated approximately 4 minutes after the first torpedo hit, producing an explosion estimated at 200 meters in height and killing an unknown proportion of the men who had survived the initial flooding and listing. The institutional process behind the physical process was also well documented, though not in institutional records that were designed to make the documentation visible. The torpedo bulge under specification was a consequence of a 1930s design standard that had not been updated to reflect German warhead development. This is documented in the engineering specifications and the warhead data that were both available to the Director of Naval Construction in 1941. The ASDIC contact dismissal was a consequence of a doctrinal framework that treated close-range ambiguous returns as non-threatening under conditions where the geometry of the fleet formation made valid returns possible. This is documented in the Flag Lieutenant's account and the post-war doctrine revision. The AA ammunition storage improvisation was a consequence of operational tempo exceeding the administrative capacity to maintain formal storage standards. This is documented in the Court of Inquiry finding and the Mediterranean operations record. The suppression of the casualty information for 63 days was a consequence of an operational calculation that placed strategic deception value above the informational needs of families. This is documented in the Admiralty censorship record and the press announcement of 27 January 1942. None of these processes was exceptional within the institutional context of 1941. The torpedo bulge standard had not been updated because updating wartime engineering standards for operational vessels required dry dock time that the Mediterranean campaign's tempo did not permit. The ASDIC doctrine had not been revised because the doctrine was performing adequately across the full range of operational scenarios, and the specific tactical geometry that made it inadequate for a capital ship formation in open water was not the scenario the doctrine had been optimized for. The ammunition storage improvisation was, by December 1941, almost certainly present on multiple vessels in the Mediterranean fleet, and addressing it across the fleet simultaneously would have required a supply chain intervention that competed with operational priorities. The suppression decision was consistent with decisions made for other losses, including Ark Royal, and reflected an institutional framework for managing wartime information that had been deliberately constructed to serve strategic objectives. Each element of the causal chain was, within its own institutional logic, comprehensible. The post-war accounting of these processes was partial and non-linear. The ASDIC doctrine revision occurred and was effective. The pattern of contact dismissals that preceded the Barham attack was not repeated in the same form in subsequent operations. The ammunition storage improvisation presumably attracted attention after the Court of Inquiry finding, though the documentary record of any theater-wide audit is not available in the publicly accessible sources consulted for this documentary. The torpedo bulge re-specification, the most fundamental technical lesson of the Barham loss, does not appear in the available record as having been formally implemented for the surviving ships of the class. Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, repaired and returned to service after the December 1941 harbor attack, do not appear to have received revised bulge standards based on the Barham loss. If the lesson was absorbed, it was absorbed as tacit operational knowledge rather than formal engineering standard. This is the pattern across the three systemic failures: partial correction, informal attribution, no formal acknowledgement. The Pathé newsreel footage shot by John Turner from HMS Valiant, approximately 180 seconds of 35mm film at 24 frames per second, capturing the capsizing and explosion of a 35,970 long-ton battleship, was censored by the Admiralty and not publicly released until the announcement of the loss in January 1942. It subsequently became one of the most widely circulated pieces of naval combat footage from the Second World War. The footage shows the physical event with a clarity that no written account can replicate: the ship rolling to port, the funnel descending toward the water, the explosion that rises above the frame. What the footage cannot show is the causal process that produced the event: the bulge specification, the doctrine, the storage arrangement, the operational tempo. Film is evidence of the physical. The systemic cause is not visible to the camera. This is, in a sense, the central methodological problem of using catastrophic events as evidence. The event itself is the most visible part of the causal chain, and the institutional factors that produced it are the least visible. The 4-minute timeline, from first impact to final sinking, is the element of the Barham record that has received the most consistent attention in secondary accounts, and it is easy to understand why. 4 minutes is comprehensible. It has a beginning and an end. It is short enough to hold in the mind as a single event. The 63 years between the launch of HMS Barham's keel at John Brown's Yard on 24 February 1913 and the formal commissioning of a historical analysis capable of tracing the causal chain from that keel to the bottom of the Mediterranean is less comprehensible. It does not have the drama of 4 minutes, and it does not produce a visible explosion. It produces, instead, a series of documents: engineering specifications, operational logs, court findings, censorship instructions, survivor accounts written 40 or 50 years after the event, foreign supply statistics published in Italian 30 years after the event. These documents are the actual evidence. The 4 minutes is what they explain. The Mediterranean at 32.34 degrees north, 26.24 degrees east, is approximately 265 meters deep at the wreck site. HMS Barham lies at that depth in a condition that, based on survey descriptions referenced in forum discussions of potential expeditions, reflects both the structural damage of the magazine explosion and the pressure effects of the descent. The wreck is a designated war grave. 1,312 men were aboard on 25 November 1941. 862 of them are in or near that wreck. The number is still there in the water. The institutions that produced it, the design authority that specified the torpedo bulge, the command structure that set the operational tempo, the doctrine office that defined ASDIC contact assessment, the court that asked the narrow questions, the admiralty that managed the information, have been reformed, reorganized, and in some cases dissolved and reconstituted in new forms over the 80-plus years since the sinking. The learning those institutions might have done with a complete and honest accounting of the causal chain was done partially, anonymously, and without formal record. The question this documentary cannot answer, because the documentary record does not answer it, is whether the men aboard Barham could have been better protected by institutions that were capable of seeing the full causal chain while there was still time to act on it. The torpedo bulge standard was knowable as inadequate before the sinking. The G7E warhead specifications were available to British intelligence in 1941, and the bulge design standard had not been updated since the 1930s. The ASDIC doctrine gap was knowable before the sinking. The geometry of the blind zone relative to capital ship formations was a function of equipment specifications that were well understood. The ammunition storage improvisation was knowable before the sinking. The Court of Enquiry found it after the fact, which means the information needed to find it beforehand was present in the system. None of these observations changes the number 862. They change what the number is evidence of. It is evidence of the cost of the gap between what institutions know and what they act on. That gap did not close on 25 November 1941. It narrowed, in some places, afterward. The question of whether it has closed further in the 80-plus years since is a question for the institutions themselves, and it is a question they should be asked.